Michael Jones had it all, or so everyone believed. A millionaire, successful and respected, he lived surrounded by luxury, but behind his flawless facade, a secret he didn't even know existed was about to shatter what remained of his sanity. 20 years after the death of his wife, Sarah, Michael was still drowning in a profound emptiness until one ordinary afternoon, a simple act of charity set in motion a series of events that would change his life forever. The young woman to whom he gave money was far more than she appeared, and what she was about to reveal would threaten everything he believed to be true. The question echoing in his mind, who was Sarah really, would lead him on a journey of secrets, betrayals, and a devastating truth. Nothing will be what it seems. Michael Jones sat in the dimly lit corner of the restaurant, a glass of expensive bourbon in his hand, staring blankly at the other patrons. The ambient hum of chatter and the clink of glasses surrounded him, but he felt utterly disconnected. At 45, he had everything money could buy, a sprawling estate in the Hamptons, a thriving investment firm, and the admiration of New York's elite. Yet, he was hollow. The wealth that once excited him now felt like a cage, and the accomplishments, empty echoes of a life that had lost its meaning. 20 years had passed since Sarah's death, and Michael had never truly recovered. His wife had been the love of his life, his anchor, and her sudden death left a void that nothing could fill. She had died young, only 25, in a car accident that still haunted his dreams. They had no children, and for Michael, that was one of the greatest regrets. He had thrown himself into his work, growing his business into an empire, thinking success would numb the pain. But no amount of money or power had ever managed to dull the ache of loneliness. Sighing deeply, he took a sip of his bourbon, the familiar burn doing little to warm him. The luxury around him, the marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and servers in tailored suits, felt oppressive tonight. As he gazed out the window at the bustling city, memories of Sarah flooded his mind. Her laughter, the way she'd light up a room, and how they had once sat in a place like this, dreaming of their future. "Would you like to see the dessert menu, Mr. Jones?" A voice broke through his thoughts. Michael looked up at the young server, her polite smile and bright eyes a stark contrast to the melancholy that weighed him down. He shook his head. "No, thank you. Just the check." As the server walked away, Michael spotted something from the corner of his eye. Across the street, a woman sat on the cold pavement, cradling a child in her arms. She looked disheveled, her hair messy and clothes worn, but her face held a quiet desperation that struck him. The baby, wrapped in a thin blanket, squirmed slightly in her arms. Michael's heart tightened as he watched the scene. How many people had walked past her tonight without a second glance? He had never been one to give much thought to people on the streets. It wasn't callousness, just a kind of selective blindness he had developed over the years. But something about this woman tugged at him, an inexplicable pull that he couldn't ignore. He signaled the server, paid his bill, and stepped out into the crisp night air. The moment he crossed the street, the woman looked up, startled. Her eyes met his, filled with both fear and exhaustion. "Excuse me," Michael said softly, pulling a few $100 bills from his wallet. "Can I help you?" The woman hesitated, her lips trembling. She glanced down at her baby, then back at him. I just need to buy some formula for my son. Please, anything helps." Michael held out the money, far more than she had probably expected. $350. Her eyes widened in disbelief, and she quickly took it, clutching the money as though it were a lifeline. Thank you so much, sir," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You don't know what this means." "Take care of him," Michael replied, his voice softer than he expected. He glanced at the child, whose tiny fingers peeked out from the worn blanket. "He looks like a fighter." The woman smiled faintly, tears welling in her eyes as she nodded. His name is Liam," Michael nodded, something deep inside him stirring. He gave a final nod and turned to leave, but the encounter stayed with him. There was something about that woman, about Liam, that he couldn't shake. He felt a strange connection, a sense of déjà vu, though he couldn't place why. The following day, Michael found himself doing something he hadn't done in years, visiting Sarah's grave. It was something he had avoided for so long, as if ignoring it would somehow lessen the weight of her absence. But today, something compelled him to go. Perhaps it was the reminder of what he had lost, or maybe it was the young woman and her child, which had stirred long-buried emotions. The cemetery was peaceful, the autumn leaves gently falling from the trees. Michael stood in front of Sarah's gravestone, his hands in the pockets of his long coat, staring at the engraved letters. Sarah Jones, beloved wife. I miss you, he whispered, his voice barely audible. I miss you every day. Memories flooded his mind again, the way Sarah would laugh at his terrible jokes, the softness of her touch, the plans they had made but never got to fulfill. They had talked about children, about filling their home with laughter and love. That dream had died with her. He knelt down, running his fingers across the cold stone. I've tried to move on, he admitted quietly, but it's like I'm stuck. I've built all this wealth, but none of it matters without you. As he knelt there, lost in thought, the sound of soft sobs broke through the silence. Michael turned, his heart skipping a beat. Just a few feet away, near the next row of graves, sat the same young woman from the night before, Ella, the woman with the baby. She was kneeling, her face buried in her hands, crying in front of a gravestone. Confused, Michael stood up slowly, his mind racing. Why was she here, of all places? And why did she look so devastated, kneeling at a grave next to his wife's? He took a hesitant step forward, his pulse quickening as he approached. When he got closer, his eyes fell on the name etched into the gravestone before her. The sight sent a cold shock through his body. It was Sarah's grave, the same grave he had just been kneeling at. The woman was crying in front of his wife's headstone. Michael's breath caught in his throat. "Excuse me," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Why are you here? How do you know Sarah?" Ella looked up, her tear-streaked face pale and full of grief. Her eyes locked with his, and in that moment, Michael saw something familiar in her face, something he couldn't quite place. "I didn't know her," Ella whispered, her voice shaking. "Not really, but she was my mother." Michael's world spun, his heart pounding in his chest. The ground beneath him seemed to shift as the weight of her words hit him like a tidal wave. "Your mother," he repeated, disbelief and confusion twisting his features. Ella nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "Sarah was my mother, and I've been searching for you for so long." The world around Michael seemed to blur, the leaves rustling in the wind, the distant sounds of passing cars, even the faint birdsong, everything faded into a strange, muffled silence. All he could hear was the echo of Ella's words reverberating in his mind. "Sarah was my mother." He stared at her, his thoughts tangled in disbelief and confusion. How could this be possible? Sarah had never mentioned a daughter. They had been married, spent years together before her death, and yet not once had she even hinted at such a monumental secret. Ella wiped at her tears, her hands trembling as she cradled her infant son, Liam, closer to her chest. The child whimpered softly, but Ella's focus remained locked on Michael, her face pale and fragile, as if she too was struggling to fully grasp the gravity of this moment. "I know it's hard to believe," she said quietly, her voice raw with emotion. "But it's the truth. Sarah, she gave me up when I was a baby. I was adopted. I've been searching for her, for answers meant for most of my life." Her eyes searched his face, looking for some sign of recognition, some confirmation that he knew something. But Michael's expression was one of shock, not understanding. Michael's breath came in shallow bursts. He took a step back, needing space to process what she had just told him. His mind raced, cycling through memories of Sarah, of their time together. Could she have hidden something this profound from him? He had thought they shared everything, dreams, fears, even the most mundane aspects of their lives. Why? His voice faltered as he tried to form the words. Why didn't she tell me? Ella shook her head, her eyes filled with sadness. I don't know. I've been asking myself the same thing since I found out who she was. I was too young to remember her, and my adoptive parents didn't know much about her either. All I ever knew was that her name was Sarah. The silence between them grew heavy, the weight of this revelation pressing down on both of them. Michael struggled to contain the storm of emotions swirling inside him. There was anger at Sarah for keeping such a life-altering secret. There was sadness over the years lost, the family he never knew he had. And then there was confusion, an overwhelming sense of being adrift in a sea of questions with no clear answers. But why come to me now? Michael asked, his voice more controlled but still edged with disbelief. Why now? After all these years? Ella hesitated, her eyes dropping to the ground. I didn't know how to find you, she admitted. When I finally got access to my adoption records, I found out who Sarah was, and I started searching for her, but by then, she was already gone. Her voice cracked with the weight of her grief. I found out she had died. Here in New York, I came to the cemetery hoping to, I don't know, find some kind of closure, and that's when I saw you. Michael took in her words, trying to piece together this impossible puzzle. It made sense in a way. Sarah had died before Ella could meet her, leaving this young woman with nothing but a gravestone to visit and a lifetime of unanswered questions. How long have you known? He asked, his voice softer now, less accusatory. In a few months, Ella replied. I've been trying to figure out how to reach out to you, but every time I tried, I got scared. I didn't know what to expect. I mean, you're Michael Jones. She gave a nervous laugh, but there was no humor in it. You're this powerful, successful man, and I'm just me, a woman who doesn't even know her real family. Michael's heart clenched at her words. The power and wealth he had spent his life accumulating suddenly felt trivial in the face of this revelation. All the money in the world couldn't have prepared him for this moment. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. Ella, he began, I didn't know. I had no idea Sarah had a daughter. If I had, things would have been different. I believe you, Ella said quietly. I never thought this was your fault. I needed to know. I needed to meet you. Michael nodded slowly, still struggling to absorb it all. He glanced down at the child in her arms, Liam, who was now dozing peacefully. And him? Michael asked, motioning toward the baby. Is he Liam? Ella said softly, looking down at her son. He's your grandson. The words hit Michael like a freight train. His grandson. He hadn't even known he had a daughter. And now, in the span of a few minutes, he had a grandson too. It was too much to process all at once, and yet there was a strange warmth spreading through his chest, a feeling of something long dormant stirring back to life. Family. He had a family. But just as quickly, doubt crept in. Sarah had kept this secret from him for a reason. Why? What had happened all those years ago that had led her to hide such an enormous part of her life from him? I need to understand, Michael said finally, his voice a little firmer now. Or I need to know why Sarah didn't tell me, why she kept you a secret. Ella nodded, understanding in her eyes. I've been trying to understand that too. I don't know the full story, but I want to know as much as you do. Michael exhaled, his mind still racing. This was a lot to unpack, a lifetime's worth of secrets, buried for decades, now uncovered with a few words. He looked at Ella again, really seeing her this time. There was something about her, something in the way her eyes shone, with the same fierce determination he had once seen in Sarah. A piece of her lived on in this young woman, and now in this child. Let's take this slow, he said, his tone softening. I need time to process all of this, but I also want to get to know you. I want to know my grandson. A flicker of hope crossed Ella's face. I'd like that, she said quietly. For the first time in what felt like years, Michael felt a glimmer of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel since Sarah's death: hope. There was a long road ahead, full of painful truths and difficult conversations, but there was also the possibility of healing, of finding some measure of peace in the family he never knew he had. "How about we get some coffee?" Michael suggested, his voice still heavy but with a touch of warmth. "I think we've got a lot to talk about." Ella smiled faintly, her eyes still red from crying, but there was a light in them now, a glimmer of relief. "I'd like that." As they walked toward the nearby cafe, Michael glanced down at Liam, his tiny face peaceful and serene. For the first time in a long time, Michael felt something stir inside him, a sense of responsibility, of purpose. This wasn't the life he had planned, but maybe, just maybe, it was the life he was meant to live now. The coffee shop was quiet, a stark contrast to the emotional storm swirling between Michael and Ella. They sat at a small table near the window, the scent of fresh coffee lingering in the air, but neither of them seemed to notice. Michael stared down into his cup, his mind still grappling with the shock of Ella's revelation. Across from him, Ella cradled baby Liam, gently rocking him as she, too, struggled to find her words. The silence between them was thick with unspoken questions. Michael felt as if he were on the edge of a precipice, one step away from a truth he wasn't sure he was ready to confront. He had spent 2 decades mourning Sarah, believing that they had shared everything, yet the existence of Ella shattered that belief. How could Sarah, the woman he had loved so deeply, have hidden something so monumental? Finally, it was Ella who broke the silence. "I've been searching for answers for so long," she began softly, her eyes fixed on Liam. "And I never thought this is how I'd find them. I don't even know what I was expecting when I came here. Certainly not this." Michael nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on his coffee. "Neither did I," he admitted, his voice low. He finally looked up, meeting Ella's eyes. "I keep asking myself, why didn't she tell me? We were married. We shared everything. Or at least, I thought we did." Ella hesitated, shifting in her seat as if the weight of the conversation was too much to bear. "Maybe she was scared," she offered tentatively. "Maybe she didn't know how to tell you." Michael frowned. "Scared? Of what? We loved each other. We could have worked through anything together." Ella sighed. "I wish I knew," she said. "I don't have all the answers either. All I know is that she gave me up when I was a baby, and I was raised by another family. I didn't even know her name until I found my adoption records." Michael's heart sank. He imagined Sarah, alone and scared, making the decision to give up her child. But why? What could have driven her to such a choice? And why had she kept it a secret from him, the one person she had always trusted? "Did you ever find out why she gave you up?" Michael asked, his voice softening. Ella shook her head. "No," she said, her voice tinged with sadness. "I've asked myself that question every day since I found out who she was. I thought maybe if I found her, I'd get the answers. But by the time I did, she was already gone." The pain in her voice was palpable, and for the first time, Michael truly saw the depth of Ella's loss. She hadn't just lost a mother she never knew. She had lost the chance to understand why she had been left behind, to ask Sarah the questions that had haunted her for so long. "I'm sorry," Michael said quietly, the words feeling inadequate but necessary. "I'm sorry you never got to meet her." Ella nodded, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I guess it just wasn't meant to be," she whispered. They sat in silence again, both lost in their own thoughts. Michael's mind drifted back to the early days of his marriage to Sarah. She had been so full of life, so vibrant, and they had dreamed of building a family together. But that dream had never come to fruition. She had never mentioned any complications, any past relationships that might explain Ella's existence. It was as if Sarah had lived an entirely separate life before they met, a life he knew nothing about. As Michael wrestled with the implications of this new reality, Ella cleared her throat, drawing his attention back to her. "I don't want to make things harder for you," she said softly. I know this is a lot to process, and I don't expect you to have all the answers right away. I needed to find you. I needed to know who you were." Michael nodded, his gaze softening as he looked at her. "I'm glad you did," he said, surprising himself with the sincerity of his words. "I didn't know about you, but now that I do, I want to get to know you. And Liam." Ella's lips trembled into a faint smile. "I'd like that too," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The moment felt fragile, as if they were standing at the beginning of something new, something that could either break apart or slowly grow into something meaningful. Michael still had so many questions about Sarah, about Ella's life, about the secrets that had kept them apart for so long. But for now, he was content to take it one step at a time. "Tell me about Liam," Michael said, nodding toward the baby in her arms. Ella smiled down at her son, her face softening. "He's everything to me," she said. "He's such a sweet baby, always smiling, always curious about the world. He's the reason I keep going, even when things get hard." Michael felt a pang in his chest as he watched her interact with Liam. He couldn't help but think about the family he had lost, Sarah, the life they could have had together, the children they had dreamed of. And now, here was Ella, with a son of her own, offering him a second chance at the family he had always wanted. "How old is he?" Michael asked, leaning forward slightly. 7 months, Ella replied, her eyes shining with pride. "He's just starting to crawl, and he's getting into everything." Michael chuckled softly, a rare smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "He looks like a handful." Ella laughed, the sound lightening the heavy mood between them. "You have no idea," she said, shaking her head. For a brief moment, the tension between them seemed to ease, and they shared a small, tentative connection. But it wasn't long before the weight of their conversation returned, and Michael's thoughts once again drifted to Sarah. There were too many unanswered questions, too many pieces of the puzzle that didn't fit. "Do you know anything about her life before I met her?" Michael asked, his voice hesitant. "Anything that might explain why she gave you up?" Ella shook her head. "No," she said quietly. "I was hoping you might have some answers. I don't know much about her life before I was born. My adoptive parents didn't know anything, and the adoption records didn't provide many details." Michael frowned, frustration bubbling up inside him. "She never mentioned anything to me," he admitted, his voice tinged with regret. "I thought I knew everything about her, but now I'm realizing there's this whole part of her life that she kept hidden from me." Ella looked down at her hands, her fingers lightly tracing patterns on the table. "Maybe she thought she was protecting you," she said softly. "From what?" Michael asked, his frustration seeping into his voice. "From her past, from the fact that she had a daughter. I would have accepted her, no matter what. I loved her. I know," Ella said quickly, her eyes wide with sympathy. "I'm not saying it was right. I'm just trying to understand, like you are." Michael sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I just don't know where to go from here," he admitted. "I feel like I've been blindsided. Everything I thought I knew about Sarah it's just gone." Ella reached across the table, her hand lightly brushing his. "We'll figure it out together," she said quietly. "We'll get the answers, somehow." Michael looked up at her, surprised by the strength in her voice. She was younger than him, yet there was a resilience in her that he hadn't expected. Despite the pain and confusion she must have felt, she was determined to find the truth, to understand the past that had been hidden from both of them. "Thank you," Michael said, his voice barely audible, "for finding me, for telling me." Ella smiled, a small, hopeful smile. "Thank you for listening," she replied. As they sat there, the sun began to set outside, casting long shadows across the cafe. The day had brought more questions than answers, but it had also brought a glimmer of hope. They didn't have all the pieces yet, but they had each other, and that, Michael realized, was a start. The sun had dipped below the horizon by the time Michael and Ella stepped out of the cafe, the cool evening air wrapping around them. They walked in silence, each lost in thought. For Michael, the weight of everything he had learned felt almost unbearable. Sarah had kept such a fundamental part of her life from him, and even now, standing next to her daughter, he felt no closer to understanding why. Ella walked a few steps behind, gently rocking Liam in her arms as the baby stirred. The streets of New York were alive with their usual hum. People rushing home from work, taxis honking, the glow of streetlights casting long shadows on the sidewalk, but Michael barely noticed. His mind was a whirlwind of questions, none of which seemed to have clear answers. After a few blocks, Michael finally spoke. "Ella," he began, his voice cautious, as if he were still afraid of the words. "There's something I need to ask you." Ella glanced up, her eyes weary but alert. "What is it?" she asked softly. Michael stopped walking, turning to face her. The vulnerability in his expression was palpable. "You said earlier that you didn't know much about Sarah's past before you were born, but do you know anything about your father?" Ella froze, her grip tightening on Liam. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. For a moment, she looked as if she were considering whether or not to answer, her lips parting slightly as if to speak, only to close again. "I don't know," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never met him. My adoptive parents didn't have any information about him. And Sarah, well, she's not here to tell me." Michael exhaled slowly, a knot forming in his stomach. Sarah had not only kept her daughter a secret, but the identity of the father as well. The thought filled him with a deep unease. Who had this man been? Had he been someone important to Sarah, or had it been a mistake, a secret she had buried along with the existence of her child? "Do you think he's still out there?" Michael asked, his voice quieter now, almost hesitant. "Do you think he even knows about you?" Ella shook her head, her expression clouded with uncertainty. "I have no idea. I've thought about it a lot, but there's no way of knowing. For all I know, he might not even know I exist." Michael's heart ached at her words. He couldn't imagine what it must have been like for her, growing up without knowing who her biological parents were. And now, even with part of the mystery solved, there was still so much left in the dark. "I don't want to overwhelm you," he said after a long pause, his eyes searching hers. "But if we ever do find out who your father is, I want to be there for you. I want to help." Ella smiled faintly, though her eyes betrayed a sadness she couldn't quite hide. "Thank you," she said softly, "but I don't want to get my hopes up. I've spent most of my life wondering about things I might never know." Michael nodded, understanding the weight of her words. He had lived a version of that himself, though in a different way. For 20 years, he had wondered what his life would have been like if Sarah hadn't died, if they had been able to grow their family together. And now, he was faced with a reality he had never anticipated. As they continued walking, Michael's thoughts shifted to the future. What would their relationship look like? Could they truly become a family after everything that had been kept from them? And what role would he play in Liam's life? The thought of being a grandfather was something that had never crossed his mind, but now that it was real, it both terrified and excited him. "Ella," Michael said, his voice more confident now, "I want to be part of your life. I know this is complicated, and I know there's a lot we don't know yet, but I'm here, for you, for Liam. I want to make up for the time we've lost." Ella stopped walking, her eyes widening slightly at his words. For a moment, she seemed unsure of how to respond, but then she smiled, a small, genuine smile that softened the tension between them. "I'd like that," she said quietly. "I've always wanted to know who my family was, and now that I've found you, I don't want to lose that." The sincerity in her voice touched something deep inside Michael. He had spent so long feeling disconnected from the world around him, but now, standing here with Ella, he felt the stirrings of a bond, fragile but real. "Would you like to come over for dinner sometime?" Michael asked, the words spilling out before he had fully thought them through. "It doesn't have to be anything formal, but I'd like to spend more time with you. Get to know you better." Ella blinked in surprise, clearly taken aback by the offer. "Dinner?" she repeated, as if the concept itself were foreign to her. Michael chuckled softly. Yeah, food, conversation. I could cook something, or we could order takeout. Whatever you're comfortable with. Ella hesitated, her eyes flicking down to Liam, who was now peacefully asleep in her arms. I don't know, she said cautiously. I haven't really done something like that in a long time. Michael's brow furrowed. What do you mean? Ella bit her lip as if unsure whether to continue. It's just, things have been hard. Since Liam was born, I've been on my own. My adoptive parents are gone, and I don't really have anyone to turn to. I've been getting by, but it's been rough. Michael felt a pang of guilt. How could he have not realized sooner what she must have been going through? Here she was, his daughter, struggling to make ends meet while he lived a life of luxury, completely unaware of her existence. Ella, he said gently, his voice filled with concern. I had no idea. You don't have to do this alone. I can help. I want to help. Ella looked away, her expression tight with emotion. I appreciate that, she said quietly, but I'm not used to relying on anyone. It's just been me and Liam for so long. I don't even know how to accept help anymore. Michael's heart broke at her words. He could hear the years of hardship, the isolation in her voice. You're not alone anymore, he said softly. I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. Ella looked up at him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. Thank you, she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. They stood there for a moment, the city bustling around them. But in that moment, it felt as if the world had narrowed down to just the two of them, and Liam. The connection between them, though new and uncertain, felt undeniable. They had both lost so much, but now there was a chance to build something new. Let's take it one step at a time, Michael said, his voice steady. We'll figure this out together. Ella nodded, a single tear slipping down her cheek. Okay, she whispered. One step at a time. As they parted ways for the night, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just shifted irrevocably. He had spent so long living in the shadow of Sarah's memory, but now he had a new purpose. He wasn't just a businessman anymore, lost in the pursuit of wealth and success. He was a father, a grandfather, and for the first time in years, he felt like he had something to live for. Michael sat alone in his spacious living room, a fire crackling softly in the hearth. The warmth from the flames did little to thaw the cold knot in his chest. His thoughts were consumed by the events of the past few days. The sudden appearance of Ella, the revelation that she was his daughter, and the fragile connection they had begun to build. It still didn't feel real. He had lived in the shadow of Sarah's death for 20 years, convinced that the life they had planned was lost to him forever. Now, in an instant, everything had changed. On the table in front of him sat an old photo album, one he hadn't opened in years. It was filled with pictures of him and Sarah during the early years of their marriage. He flipped through the pages slowly, his heart aching with every image of her smiling face. She had been his everything, his love, his best friend, his partner in all things. How could she have kept something so monumental from him? The thought had haunted him since his conversation with Ella. He tried to reconcile the Sarah he knew, the kind, loving woman who had stood by his side for years, with the version of her that Ella had revealed, the woman who had given up a child and hidden it from him. It didn't make sense. Michael wanted to believe that Sarah had a good reason, that there was some explanation that could make it all make sense. But the more he thought about it, the more questions he had. Michael closed the album, the sound of the pages snapping shut, echoing in the quiet room. He needed answers. He couldn't move forward with Ella, couldn't fully embrace this new chapter of his life without understanding why Sarah had kept this secret from him. But where could he start? Sarah was gone, and whatever reasons she had for keeping Ella a secret had died with her. The fire crackled again, and Michael sighed, leaning back into the leather chair. He knew that if he wanted answers, there was one person he had to talk to: David. David had been Sarah's closest friend before she and Michael had married. He had known her better than anyone during those early years. Maybe he knew something Michael didn't, something that could shed light on this mystery. The thought of confronting David made Michael's stomach twist with anxiety. The two of them had grown apart in recent years, their friendship strained by distance and the passage of time. Still, if anyone knew anything about Sarah's life before she met Michael, it would be David. Taking a deep breath, Michael reached for his phone. His fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before he finally dialed the number. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "David?" Michael's voice was tentative, uncertain. There was a brief pause on the other end, followed by a surprised, "Michael, wow, it's been a while. How are you?" Michael hesitated. He wasn't sure how to begin, how to explain everything that had happened. "I've been better," he admitted, his voice heavy. "Listen, David, there's something I need to talk to you about. It's about Sarah." David's tone immediately shifted, becoming more serious. "What is it? What's going on?" Michael took a deep breath, steadying himself. "It's a long story, but I found out something. Something I never knew. Sarah had a daughter she never told me about." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. When David finally spoke, his voice was filled with disbelief. "What? Sarah had a child? Michael, are you sure?" "I'm sure," Michael replied, his jaw tightening. "Her name is Ella, and she showed up at Sarah's grave a few days ago. I've met her, and it's real, David. She's Sarah's daughter." David was quiet for a long moment, and Michael could almost hear the wheels turning in his old friend's mind. I don't know what to say," David finally said. "I didn't know. Sarah never told me anything about having a child." Michael's heart sank. He had hoped, prayed, that David might have some insight, some piece of the puzzle that could explain why Sarah had kept this secret. But it seemed that even her closest friends had been left in the dark. "I don't understand," Michael said, his voice tight with frustration. "Why didn't she tell me? We were married, David. We shared everything. How could she have hidden something like this from me?" David sighed on the other end of the line. "I wish I had answers for you, Michael. Sarah was complicated. There were things about her past that she didn't talk about much. Even with me, I always got the sense that there were parts of her life she wasn't ready to confront." Michael's grip tightened on the phone. "What parts? What do you mean?" David hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with where the conversation was going. "Before she met you, Sarah had a pretty rough time. She never gave me details, but she hinted at things, mistakes, regrets. I didn't push her on it because I respected her privacy, but maybe this is part of that." Michael felt a cold chill run down his spine. "Mistakes? Regrets? What are you saying, David? That Ella was some kind of mistake?" "No," David said quickly, his voice firm. "I don't mean that. I just mean Sarah carried a lot of guilt. I could see it in her sometimes, in the way she would get quiet whenever her past came up. I think there were things she wanted to leave behind, things she didn't want to face." Michael sat back in his chair, his mind spinning. He had always known that Sarah's early life hadn't been easy. She had mentioned in passing that she'd gone through difficult times before they met, but he had never pressed her for details. Now, he wished he had. Maybe if he had known more, if he had asked the right questions, he wouldn't be in this position, blindsided by a truth that had been buried for decades. "Michael," David's voice broke through his thoughts. "I don't know if this helps, but whatever Sarah did, I'm sure she thought she was doing the right thing. She loved you. I know that for a fact." Michael closed his eyes, his chest tightening with emotion. "I just don't understand why she didn't trust me enough to tell me," he said quietly. "If she had, maybe things could have been different." David sighed softly. "Maybe, but we can't change the past, Michael. All we can do is try to make sense of it and move forward." Michael nodded, though his heart felt heavy. Moving forward seemed like an impossible task when the past still held so many unanswered questions. But he knew David was right. He couldn't change what had happened. All he could do now was figure out how to move forward with Ella, to build a relationship with the daughter he never knew he had. "Thanks, David," Michael said after a long pause. "I appreciate you talking to me about this." "Of course," David replied. "And Michael, If you need anything, I'm here. Don't hesitate to reach out. I will, Michael said, though he wasn't sure if he really would. After saying their goodbyes, he hung up the phone and stared into the fire, his mind still churning with thoughts of Sarah, of the secrets she had taken to her grave. As the flames flickered, casting shadows across the room, Michael made a decision. He couldn't let this mystery hang over him forever. He had to know the truth, and if David didn't have the answers, then maybe there was another way to find out. The next morning, Michael drove to the cemetery again, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as he made his way through the familiar streets. He hadn't been able to sleep the night before, his mind consumed with thoughts of Sarah and Ella. He needed closure, and the only place he could think to go was Sarah's grave. When he arrived, the cemetery was quiet, the only sound the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. Michael made his way to Sarah's gravestone, standing in front of it for a long moment before kneeling down. "I don't know why you did it," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't know why you kept her from me, but I need to understand. I need to know what happened, Sarah." The wind picked up slightly, as if answering his plea, but the only response was silence. Days passed, but the unease in Michael's chest never faded. The conversation with David had left him with more questions than answers, and no matter how much he tried to focus on other things, his thoughts always circled back to Sarah. His mind constantly replayed David's words, mistakes, regrets. What had Sarah been running from, and why had she felt the need to hide such a crucial part of her life from him? Michael found himself increasingly consumed by the mystery of Sarah's past. But he knew that if he didn't start moving forward, he would never find peace. Ella was waiting for him to step into her life, and he wanted to be the father and grandfather that she needed. But he couldn't do it until he resolved the questions gnawing at his soul. He decided that it was time to take a step he had been avoiding for too long, meeting with Ella again, but this time with the intention of talking about the one person who connected them both, Sarah. He needed to ask Ella more about what she knew, and they needed to work together to uncover the truth. It was a crisp Saturday morning when Michael invited Ella over to his home. The sprawling estate was a far cry from the modest life Ella lived, and he couldn't shake the guilt he felt about the years she had spent struggling while he had lived in comfort, unaware of her existence. He was determined to change that, to build something meaningful between them now that they had been brought together. Ella arrived at his home with Liam in her arms, the baby bundled up in a soft blanket to shield him from the autumn chill. As Michael opened the door to greet them, he was struck again by how surreal it all felt. This young woman, his daughter, standing on his doorstep with her own child, his grandson. "Come in," Michael said, offering a tentative smile. He led them into the living room, where a fire crackled warmly in the fireplace. Ella looked around, clearly taking in the luxury of the place, but she didn't comment. Instead, she settled onto the couch with Liam, bouncing him gently on her knee as the baby gurgled happily. "This place is beautiful," Ella said quietly after a moment, her eyes scanning the room. "I never imagined I'd be here." Michael smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I didn't either," he admitted, sitting down across from her. "It's strange, isn't it? How life can throw something at you that changes everything." Ella nodded, her gaze softening as she looked at Liam. "Yeah, it is. I've spent so long trying to figure out who I was, and now that I've found you, I guess it's still sinking in." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared past hanging between them. Michael felt the tension in the air, a reminder that while they were family, they were still strangers in so many ways. But there was a sense of hope too, hope that they could forge something new together. "I'm glad you're here," Michael said after a long pause, his voice earnest. "I've been thinking a lot about you, about everything that's happened, and I've realized that I need to understand more about Sarah, about why she kept you a secret from me." Ella's expression darkened slightly, her lips pressing together in a thin line. "I've been thinking about that too," she admitted, I've been trying to piece things together, but there's still so much I don't know. Michael leaned forward, his gaze intense. I want us to figure it out together. I want to know what happened in her past that led to all of this. Ella hesitated, her hands resting protectively on Liam as she considered his words. I want that too, she said finally. But where do we even start? Michael had been thinking about that question for days. He had gone over everything he knew about Sarah's life before they met, but it wasn't much. She had been private about her early years, rarely speaking about her family or childhood, but there had been one name that had come up a few times, someone Sarah had mentioned briefly when they were first dating. Do you know anything about a man named David? Michael asked carefully. He was a close friend of Sarah's before we got married. I talked to him a few days ago, and he mentioned that Sarah had some regrets from her past, but he didn't know anything about you. Ella's brow furrowed in thought. David, I've never heard that name before, she said slowly. But then again, I don't know much about her life after she gave me up. Maybe he was part of the life she built after that. Michael nodded, though the lack of new information was frustrating. He had hoped that Ella might know something more, some clue that could help them understand why Sarah had kept her daughter a secret. But it seemed that Sarah had been just as guarded with Ella as she had been with him. I was hoping we could find something, Michael said, his voice soft with disappointment, some way to fill in the gaps. Ella glanced down at Liam, who had begun to fuss in her arms. She bounced him gently, soothing him with soft shushing sounds before looking back at Michael. Maybe we can, she said quietly. I found something when I was going through my things recently. It's a letter from Sarah. Michael's heart skipped a beat. A letter? What does it say? Ella reached into the bag she had brought with her, pulling out a worn envelope. She handed it to Michael, her expression serious. I've read it 100 times, but it's still hard to make sense of. Maybe you'll see something I missed. Michael took the envelope with trembling hands, his breath catching in his throat. The sight of Sarah's handwriting on the front, her neat, elegant script, brought a flood of memories rushing back. He hadn't seen her handwriting in so long, and the sight of it now made his chest tighten with emotion. He unfolded the letter carefully, his eyes scanning the words. As he read, his heart sank. My dearest Ella, I've struggled with writing this letter for years, and I'm not sure if you'll ever receive it. There are so many things I wish I could say to you in person, but I fear that you'll never understand why I made the choices I did. I gave you up because I wanted you to have a better life than the one I could offer. I wanted you to be free of the mistakes I made, of the burdens I carried. You deserve so much more than what I could give you, and I thought I was doing what was best for you. But even as I write this, I know that it's not enough. I know that no words can ever explain why I left you, why I kept you a secret. I hope that one day you'll find it in your heart to forgive me. I loved you then, and I love you still. Sarah Michael stared at the letter, his hands trembling slightly as he folded it back up. The words echoed in his mind, each sentence a painful reminder of how much he had never known about the woman he had loved. I don't understand, he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Why didn't she tell me? Ella's eyes were filled with tears as she looked at him, her voice trembling with emotion. I've asked myself the same thing 1,000 times. She says she did it for me, but it still hurts. Michael nodded, his heart aching with a mix of grief and confusion. He couldn't change the past, couldn't go back and ask Sarah the questions that would give him the answers he so desperately needed. But now, with Ella by his side, he could at least try to understand. They could work together to uncover the truth. We'll figure this out, Michael said, his voice firm despite the turmoil inside him. We'll find the answers, Ella. Ella nodded, wiping away a tear as she clutched Liam closer to her. I hope so, she whispered. As the fire crackled softly in the background, Michael felt the weight of the past pressing down on him. But this time, he wasn't facing it alone. He had Ella now, and together they would confront the ghosts of Sarah's secrets, one step at a time. The letter weighed heavy in Michael's pocket as he sat in his office, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. The view of New York was as breathtaking as ever. The tall buildings, the constant motion of cars and people below. But today, it felt distant and irrelevant. His mind was elsewhere, consumed by the words Sarah had written to Ella. "I thought I was doing what was best for you." That one sentence had haunted him ever since Ella had placed the letter in his hands. It was clear that Sarah believed she had made the right decision, but the letter didn't explain why. Michael had no more clarity now than he did before reading it. Sarah had still kept Ella a secret, and the reasons for that choice remained maddeningly out of reach. Michael leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his graying hair. He had spent hours replaying the few clues he had over and over in his mind, hoping that something would finally click. But all he had was a vague sense that Sarah had been running from something in her past that had driven her to make the heartbreaking decision to give up her child and keep it hidden from him. Ella, too, had been left with more questions than answers. After reading the letter, they had talked for hours, sharing memories of Sarah and speculating about what might have led her to such a drastic choice. But in the end, they had been left with little more than theories, and Michael couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than they were seeing. The only way to move forward, Michael realized, was to dig deeper into Sarah's past. He had to uncover whatever secrets she had been keeping, whatever regrets she had carried with her all those years. Only then could he and Ella begin to truly understand. But how? Michael didn't know where to start. Sarah had never been one to talk about her life before they met. She'd been so careful, so guarded. If she had been hiding something, she had hidden it well. Just as Michael was about to resign himself to another dead end, his phone buzzed on the desk. He glanced at the screen, surprised to see Ella's name. They had agreed to give each other some space after their emotional conversation, but now she was calling him only days later. "Ella?" Michael answered, his voice calm but concerned. "Is everything okay?" Ella's voice trembled on the other end, and Michael immediately knew something was wrong. "Michael," she began, her words rushed and anxious. "I found something else. It was buried in some old boxes I hadn't gone through yet." Michael's pulse quickened. "What did you find?" "A letter, but it's not from Sarah. It's from a man named David." Michael's breath caught in his throat. David. The name instantly triggered memories of their recent conversation. The vague hints David had given about Sarah's regrets, the secrets she had carried. "David," Michael repeated, his voice tight with anticipation. "What does the letter say?" I'm not sure how to explain it," Ella said, her voice wavering. "It talks about him and Sarah, something about a relationship they had before she met you." Michael's heart pounded in his chest. A relationship with David. He had known David and Sarah had been close friends, but a relationship, that was something Sarah had never mentioned. And now, suddenly, everything about her secretive behavior started to make sense. Could it be that the regret Sarah had carried, the one David had alluded to, was tied to him? "I need to see it," Michael said quickly, his mind racing. "Can you bring it to me?" "Of course," Ella replied. "I'll be there soon." The drive from Ella's modest apartment to Michael's luxurious townhouse felt like an eternity, though in reality, it was only 30 minutes. As Ella approached, she couldn't shake the growing sense of unease that had settled in her stomach ever since she had found the letter. She had always assumed her mother's past was complicated, but the thought that Sarah might have been involved in something even more personal, something tied to her and Michael's life together, left her feeling both confused and betrayed. When Ella finally arrived at Michael's home, she was greeted by the sight of him standing at the front door, his expression serious but welcoming. She stepped inside, carefully cradling Liam in her arms while balancing the worn envelope she had found. "Here," she said, handing the letter to Michael as soon as she was through the door. "It's all in here." Michael took the envelope with trembling hands, his heart pounding. He carefully unfolded the letter, his eyes scanning the familiar handwriting of his old friend. The more he read, the colder his blood ran. "Sarah, I don't know how to say this any other way. I can't stop thinking about what we had. I know it was brief, and I know you've moved on with Michael, but I can't forget it. I still think about you, about us, and I wish things could have been different. Maybe in another life, we would have had a chance. I just need you to know that I loved you. I hope you're happy now. You deserve that." The words struck Michael like a physical blow. The letter was dated only a few months before he and Sarah had married. David hadn't just been a friend. He had been in love with her, and worse, Sarah had never told him. Michael sat down heavily, his hands shaking as he placed the letter on the coffee table. His mind was spinning, emotions swirling inside him like a storm. Anger, betrayal, confusion, they all collided in his chest, leaving him gasping for breath. "I don't understand," he muttered, more to himself than to Ella. "Why didn't she tell me? Why didn't either of them tell me?" Ella watched him carefully, her own emotions swirling just as violently. "I don't know," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But this changes things, doesn't it?" Michael nodded slowly, his eyes still locked on the letter in front of him. "It does," he whispered. "It changes everything." For years, Michael had believed that he and Sarah had shared everything, every secret, every fear, every dream. But now, he was faced with the stark reality that there had been parts of her life she had kept hidden from him, parts of her past that he hadn't been able to touch. The knowledge that David had loved her, that they had shared something before Michael came into the picture, was a bitter pill to swallow. "I can't believe she never told me," Michael said, his voice cracking with emotion. "After all these years, I thought I knew her, but now I don't know what to think." Ella sat down beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm. "Michael, I don't think she ever wanted to hurt you. She probably thought she was protecting you." "Protecting me?" Michael scoffed, his voice laced with bitterness. "How? By lying to me? By hiding something this important?" Ella shook her head, her eyes filled with sympathy. "I don't know, but maybe there's more to it than we realize. Maybe she didn't know how to tell you." Michael sighed heavily, his head falling into his hands. He had thought that finding the truth would bring him some kind of closure, but instead, it had only opened up more wounds. He had trusted David, had considered him a friend, and now he was faced with the realization that David had been in love with Sarah the whole time. Worse, Sarah had never told him. "What do we do now?" Ella asked softly, her voice gentle but firm. Michael looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and determination. "We keep digging," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "There has to be more. There's always more." Ella nodded, her expression mirroring his resolve. Together, they would continue searching for the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The air in Michael's townhouse was thick with tension. The revelation of David's letter had cracked open the fragile stability Michael had tried to build since discovering Ella. Now, sitting across from his daughter, his mind buzzed with unanswered questions, each one more painful than the last. How long had David been in love with Sarah? Had there been more between them than just friendship before she married him? Most troubling of all, was this the reason she had kept Ella a secret? Michael's thoughts raced as he tried to process the implications. His world had been turned upside down, and every answer seemed to lead to more confusion, more betrayal. He couldn't look at David the same way anymore, and even the memory of Sarah, so cherished, so precious, felt tainted by the shadows of her past. Ella sat quietly, her arms wrapped protectively around Liam, as if the baby could shield her from the emotional storm brewing around them. She had come here hoping for clarity, for answers that might finally give her peace, but instead they had uncovered more secrets, secrets that made everything feel even more uncertain. "I don't understand," Michael muttered for the third time, his voice a low, pained whisper. "Why didn't she tell me?" Ella bit her lip, her brow furrowed in thought. Maybe she was afraid. she said softly. Afraid that if you knew about David, it would change the way you saw her. But it does change things, Michael replied, his voice strained. It changes everything. She kept a whole part of her life hidden from me. How can I trust anything now? Ella reached across the table, placing a gentle hand on his arm. Michael, I don't think Sarah did this to hurt you. She probably thought she was protecting you. Michael shook his head, frustration bubbling up inside him. Protecting me from what? From the truth. I would have understood if she had told me about David. We could have worked through it together. But now, his voice trailed off, and he let out a deep sigh. Now, I don't even know who she really was. For a long moment, the two sat in silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. Outside, the sky had darkened, casting long shadows through the large windows of the living room. The fire crackled in the hearth, but its warmth did little to ease the chill between them. Ella watched Michael carefully, her expression full of empathy. She understood the pain he was feeling. She had been living with it her whole life. For years, she had wondered why her birth mother had abandoned her, why she had chosen to keep her existence a secret. And now, faced with the possibility that her mother had been hiding even more, she felt the familiar ache of abandonment all over again. I've been asking myself the same questions, Ella said quietly. Why didn't she want me? Why didn't she tell me about you? But maybe we're looking at this all wrong. Maybe it wasn't about keeping things from us. It was about protecting us from something she thought we couldn't handle. Michael looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and confusion. What do you mean? I mean, there has to be more to this story, Ella replied. It doesn't make sense for her to hide everything unless she thought it was the only way to protect the people she loved. Maybe whatever happened between her and David was more complicated than we realize. Maybe there's something else she was trying to keep buried. Michael frowned, her words sparking a new line of thought in his mind. He had always seen Sarah as a loving, open person, someone who wore her heart on her sleeve. But if there had been something darker in her past, something she had been running from, it might explain why she had gone to such lengths to keep Ella's existence a secret. Maybe she had feared that revealing the truth would cause more harm than good. What if? Michael hesitated, the thought almost too painful to voice. What if there was something more between them? Something that she didn't want me to know because she thought it would destroy our relationship. Ella's face tightened at the suggestion, and she shook her head. I don't want to believe that, she said softly. I don't want to think that she kept me a secret because of something that happened between her and David. But it's possible, Michael finished for her, his voice hollow. It's possible that Sarah didn't just leave you to protect you. She might have done it to protect herself. The idea hung between them, heavy and unsettling. If Sarah's decision to give up Ella had been motivated by something more personal, something tied to her relationship with David, then it meant that everything Michael had believed about their marriage was built on a lie. I think we need to talk to David again, Ella said after a long pause. We need to hear his side of the story. Michael nodded slowly, though the thought of confronting David filled him with dread. He had already confronted his old friend once, asking for answers, and David had been evasive, unwilling to share much about Sarah's past. But now, with the letter in hand, there was no escaping the truth. Michael needed to know exactly what had happened between Sarah and David before they could move forward. I'll call him, Michael said, his voice grim with determination. We'll meet with him and get to the bottom of this. Ella nodded in agreement, though a flicker of doubt crossed her face. Do you think he'll tell us the truth this time? She asked. Michael hesitated, then shook his head. I don't know, he admitted, but we have to try. The following afternoon, Michael made the call. His hands trembled slightly as he dialed David's number, the memory of their last conversation still fresh in his mind. When David answered, his voice was warm but cautious, as if sensing that something was wrong. Michael, David said, his tone tentative. I wasn't expecting to hear from you again so soon. What's going on? There's something we need to talk about, Michael replied, his voice steady despite the tension in his chest. It's about Sarah. And about you." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, and when David spoke again, his voice was quieter, more guarded. "What do you mean?" Michael took a deep breath, his grip tightening on the phone. "I found the letter, David, the one you wrote to Sarah. We know there was something between you two." There was a long silence, and Michael could almost hear the sound of David's heart pounding through the phone. When he finally spoke, his voice was full of resignation. "I'll come by," David said. "We need to talk." An hour later, David arrived at Michael's townhouse, his face pale and drawn. Michael greeted him at the door, his expression hard and unreadable. Without a word, he led David into the living room, where Ella sat waiting, Liam in her arms. The tension in the room was palpable as David took a seat across from them, his hands fidgeting nervously in his lap. "I guess you know everything now," David said quietly, his eyes flicking between Michael and Ella. Michael didn't reply immediately. Instead, he pulled out the letter and placed it on the coffee table between them. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice cold. "Why didn't either of you tell me?" David sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "It wasn't my place to tell you, Michael," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "Sarah made her decision, and I had to respect that." "What decision?" Michael demanded, his voice rising with frustration. "What are you talking about?" David hesitated, then looked directly at Michael, his expression filled with guilt. "There's something you don't know, Michael. Something that changes everything." Michael's heart raced, and for a moment, he could hardly breathe. "What is it?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. David took a deep breath, his eyes full of sorrow as he finally spoke the words that would shatter Michael's world. "Ella isn't just Sarah's daughter," David said, his voice trembling. "She's my daughter too." The room fell into an eerie, suffocating silence after David's words. Michael stared at him, his heart pounding in his chest as if trying to escape the shock and betrayal that now surrounded him. Ella sat frozen beside him, her wide eyes fixed on David, the man who had just shattered everything she thought she knew about her life. "Ella is my daughter." Those 5 words echoed endlessly in Michael's mind. For so long, he had been struggling to reconcile the woman he had loved with the secrets she had kept from him. But now, the betrayal cut deeper than he could have ever imagined. Not only had Sarah hidden the existence of her daughter, but that daughter had never been his. She had belonged to another man, his friend. Michael's voice was low and trembling when he finally spoke. "What did you just say?" David swallowed hard, his eyes filled with regret. "I never meant for it to happen this way, Michael. But it's the truth. Ella is my daughter." Ella gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth. She had expected secrets, maybe even something difficult to hear about her mother's past. But this was beyond anything she could have imagined. Her entire identity, her very existence, was now being rewritten before her eyes. You're my father," Ella whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of the revelation. David nodded slowly, his face etched with sorrow. "Yes," he said softly, "I am. I've known for a long time, but I didn't know how to tell you." Michael stood abruptly, unable to sit still any longer. He paced the room, his hands clenched into fists as he tried to control the rage bubbling inside him. How could David have kept this from him for so long? How could Sarah have allowed him to believe that Ella was his child, when in reality she had been David's? "You knew." Michael's voice was sharp, his eyes blazing with fury as he turned on David. "You've known this whole time, and you didn't say a word. You let me believe. I didn't let you believe anything," David interrupted, his voice firm but tinged with guilt. "Sarah made that decision. She thought it was best for everyone if the truth stayed buried. She didn't want to destroy what you two had." Michael's hands shook as he pointed angrily at David. "So you just went along with it. You let me marry her. Let me build a life with her, all the while knowing that you were the father of her child. What kind of person does that?" David lowered his head, his voice quiet and filled with regret. "I loved Sarah. I thought I was doing what was right." "Right," Michael scoffed, his voice thick with bitterness. "You think it was right to keep a secret like this?" To let me raise another man's child and not even know it? Ella remained silent, her face pale as she absorbed the truth. She looked between the two men, Michael, the man she had thought was her father, and David, the man who had just claimed that title. Her entire world had been upended, and she didn't know how to process it. The man she had been searching for all her life had been sitting in front of her the whole time, but he hadn't said a word. Tears welled up in Ella's eyes as she turned to David, her voice trembling with emotion. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you ever reach out to me? I spent my whole life not knowing who I was, and you—" David's face contorted with pain as he reached out toward Ella, but she recoiled, hugging Liam closer to her chest. "I didn't know how," he admitted, his voice raw with emotion. "I didn't want to disrupt your life. I thought you were better off not knowing." Ella's voice cracked as she replied, "You thought I was better off living without the truth, without knowing my own father." "I didn't want to hurt you," David said, his voice almost pleading. "I thought it would be better if you grew up without this hanging over your head." Michael let out a bitter laugh, his eyes cold as he stared at David. "Better for you, maybe." David's gaze dropped to the floor, and for a moment, none of them spoke. The weight of the revelation hung heavily in the air, and the tension between them felt unbearable. Michael turned to Ella, his expression softening despite the pain he felt. "Ella, I'm so sorry," he said, his voice full of sorrow. "I didn't know. If I had known—" Ella shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "It's not your fault, Michael," she whispered. "I know you didn't know, but that doesn't make it any easier." Michael's heart broke as he watched the young woman he had come to care for so deeply, now reeling from a truth that had been kept from both of them. He wanted to comfort her, to tell her that everything would be okay, but how could he? Everything had changed. Finally, David stood, his face pale and drawn. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice shaking. "I never wanted any of this to happen. I loved Sarah, and when she told me she was pregnant, we thought it was best if I stayed out of it. But I should have told you, Ella. I should have told you a long time ago." Ella didn't reply. She simply turned away from him, her shoulders trembling as she fought back sobs. David's eyes flicked to Michael, who stood a few feet away, his expression a mix of anger and devastation. "Michael, I know you'll never forgive me for this," David said softly. "But I did what I thought was right at the time. I never meant to hurt you." Michael's jaw clenched, his voice tight with barely restrained fury. "You may not have meant to, but you did. You hurt me. You hurt Ella. And you betrayed Sarah by hiding the truth. I don't know if I can ever forgive you for that." David nodded, his face filled with regret. "I understand." For a long moment, the three of them stood in silence, the gravity of the situation settling over them like a suffocating blanket. Michael wanted to scream, to demand answers, to lash out at the man who had taken so much from him. But in the end, he knew that nothing could change what had already happened. The truth was out now, and they would all have to live with it. Finally, David turned to leave, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "I'll go," he said quietly, his voice barely audible. "But if either of you ever want to talk, if you ever want to understand more about what happened, I'll be here. I'll be waiting." Michael didn't reply, and Ella remained silent as well. As David walked out the door, the sound of it closing behind him felt like the end of something, an end to the lies, the secrets, the betrayals. But it didn't feel like a resolution. It felt like a fracture, a wound that would take time, if it ever could, to heal. After David left, the silence in the house was deafening. Michael and Ella sat across from each other, both of them reeling from what had just been revealed. Neither of them knew what to say, and the weight of the truth felt almost unbearable. Finally, Ella broke the silence, her voice hoarse from crying. "What do we do now?" she asked, her eyes searching Michael's for answers. Michael sighed deeply, his heart heavy. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice filled with sadness. "I don't know where we go from here." Ella wiped her tears away with the back of her hand, her expression filled with a mixture of pain and determination. "I need time," she said quietly. "I need time to figure out what this means for me, for Liam." Michael nodded slowly, understanding the weight of her words. "Take all the time you need," he said gently. "I'll be here." "For both of you." Ella managed a weak smile, though her eyes were still filled with sadness. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know what I'd do without you." As the evening wore on and the house grew quiet, Michael couldn't help but reflect on how drastically his life had changed. The woman he had loved, the daughter he had never known, the secrets that had unraveled everything, it was almost too much to bear. But despite everything, one truth remained. He had Ella now, and no matter what had happened in the past, no matter the lies or betrayals, he would do everything in his power to be the father she needed, even if the road ahead was fraught with pain. The days after David's confession passed in a blur for Michael. He moved through his routines in a daze, each task feeling hollow as his mind continued to replay the revelation that Ella wasn't his daughter by blood. The man who had been his friend, the man he had trusted, had kept a secret that had changed everything. Michael had built a relationship with Ella, believing that she was a part of Sarah and him, a final connection to the love they had shared. Now, that belief was gone. Michael found himself questioning everything: his love for Sarah, their marriage, their years together. How much of it had been built on lies? Had she ever planned to tell him about David and the truth behind Ella's birth? Or had she intended for him to live his life never knowing, blissfully unaware of the secret she had taken to her grave? As Michael wrestled with these questions, he couldn't shake the sense of betrayal. He had always believed that love meant honesty, that his relationship with Sarah had been founded on trust. But now he realized that there had been parts of her life he had never known. It wasn't just the revelation about Ella that hurt. It was the realization that Sarah had lived with such a monumental secret and hadn't trusted him enough to share it. Despite his anger and hurt, Michael couldn't ignore his feelings for Ella. She wasn't responsible for the choices Sarah and David had made, and she had come into his life with the hope of finding the family she had lost. Michael cared for her deeply, and no matter what the truth was about her parentage, she was still a part of his world now. She was still his daughter in every way that mattered. But where did that leave him? And where did that leave Ella? Michael sat in his living room one evening, the soft glow of the fire casting long shadows across the room. His phone buzzed beside him, and when he picked it up, he saw Ella's name flashing on the screen. A sense of relief washed over him as he answered, though there was also a knot of tension in his chest. They hadn't spoken since David's confession, and he had no idea what she was thinking or feeling. "Hey," Michael said quietly, his voice soft. "Hey," Ella replied, her voice hesitant. "I've been thinking a lot about everything." Michael sighed, nodding even though she couldn't see him. "I have too," he admitted. "It's a lot to take in." "Yeah," Ella whispered, her voice cracking slightly. "I don't know what to do, Michael. I thought finding you would give me answers, but instead, it's just raised more questions. I feel like I don't even know who I am anymore." Michael's heart ached at the pain in her voice. "Ella, you're still you," he said gently. "None of this changes the person you are. It doesn't change the fact that you're an incredible mother or that you've shown so much strength through all of this. But it changes everything I thought I knew about myself," Ella replied, her voice full of uncertainty. "I spent my whole life not knowing where I came from, and now that I've found out, it's not what I expected." Michael nodded slowly. He understood her pain, perhaps more than she realized. He had spent the last 20 years believing in a version of Sarah and their life together that had now been irrevocably changed. The truth had shaken his foundation, just as it had hers. "I get it," Michael said softly. "It feels like the ground has been pulled out from under you, but I'm still here, Ella. I'm not going anywhere." Ella was silent for a moment, and Michael could hear the faint sounds of Liam in the background, his soft babbling a reminder of the little life they both cared about. "I don't know what this means for us," Ella finally said. "You've been amazing, and I've started to think of you as, well, as my father. But now, I am your father." "Ella," Michael interrupted, his voice firm but kind. "Blood doesn't change that. I've been here for you, and I'll continue to be here for you. I know it's confusing, but you don't have to figure it all out right now." Ella let out a shaky breath. "I don't know if I can accept that," she whispered. "Everything feels so complicated." Michael's heart sank at her words, but he didn't push her. He knew she needed time to process everything she had learned, time to reconcile her feelings. "Take all the time you need," he said softly. "Just know that I'm here no matter what." There was a long pause before Ella spoke again. "Can we meet tomorrow? I want to talk more, face to face." "Of course," Michael replied, relief flooding his chest. "Come by the house whenever you're ready." The next morning, Michael found himself standing in his kitchen, anxiously brewing a pot of coffee as he waited for Ella to arrive. He hadn't slept much the night before, his mind racing with everything that had happened. But he knew that today was important. They needed to have an honest conversation, one that would help them move forward, even if it was painful. When Ella finally arrived, she looked tired, her eyes red from what Michael guessed had been hours of crying. Liam was with her, nestled quietly in her arms, his tiny face a picture of innocence amid the chaos of their lives. Michael greeted them with a soft smile, though his heart was heavy. "Come in," he said, stepping aside to let her through the door. They settled in the living room, the tension between them palpable. For a while, neither of them spoke, the weight of the past few days hanging over them like a dark cloud. Finally, Ella broke the silence. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began quietly, her eyes fixed on Liam, "about how blood doesn't change things." Michael nodded, his gaze soft as he listened. "And I want to believe that," Ella continued, her voice wavering. "I want to believe that we can still have a relationship, that you can still be my father. But it's hard. It's hard knowing that everything I thought I knew about my life isn't true." Michael's heart clenched at her words, but he remained calm. "I understand," he said gently. "It's going to take time, Ella. I don't expect everything to be perfect right away. But we can get through this together." Ella looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and hope. "I don't want to lose you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I've already lost so much." Michael's chest tightened, and without thinking, he reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "You won't lose me," he promised, his voice steady. "We'll figure this out. We'll find a way." Ella's grip on his hand tightened, and for the first time in days, Michael saw a flicker of hope in her eyes. It wasn't much, but it was something, and right now, that was all he needed. As they sat together in silence, the enormity of their situation still looming large, Michael knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be more difficult conversations, more painful truths to confront. But he also knew that they had something worth fighting for. Family wasn't just about blood. It was about love, about the connections they had built over time, about the willingness to stand by each other even when the truth was hard to bear. Ella was his daughter in every way that mattered, and no matter what, he would be there for her, and for Liam. The rest, he would figure out as they went. The following days passed with a fragile sense of normalcy. Michael and Ella had taken cautious steps toward healing, their conversations more frequent but still guarded. Each interaction felt like they were both trying to find solid ground after everything had been uprooted by David's revelation. Michael, despite his inner turmoil, stayed focused on what mattered most, ensuring Ella knew that she had a place in his life, no matter the circumstances surrounding her birth. But the questions lingered. The more Michael thought about Sarah's choices, the more restless he became. Why had she hidden Ella from him? Why had she decided that David's identity as Ella's father should remain a secret? It wasn't enough to know that she had been trying to protect them. There had to be something more, something deeper that motivated Sarah's actions. Michael knew that if he wanted closure, if he wanted to move forward with Ella and rebuild some sense of peace, he needed to dig further into Sarah's past. There had to be answers buried somewhere, answers that could explain why Sarah had made the choices she had. The problem was, Michael wasn't sure where to begin. He had already spoken to David, and that conversation had only left him more confused. The old friends they had once shared were no longer in their lives, and Sarah's family had always been distant, never part of their marriage in any meaningful way. Then, one evening, as Michael was sitting alone in his study, a thought struck him. Sarah had always been a private person, but there had been one place where she had kept her deepest thoughts, her journals. Michael hadn't thought about them in years, but he remembered how Sarah would spend hours writing in those small, leather-bound notebooks, filling them with reflections and memories. Could they hold the answers he was looking for? The next morning, Michael found himself in the attic, sorting through old boxes that hadn't been touched since Sarah's death. Dust particles floated in the sunlight, streaming through the small window, and the air was thick with the scent of old cardboard and forgotten belongings. After what felt like hours of searching, Michael finally found them. 3 small journals, their pages yellowed with age, the covers worn from use. He sat down on the floor of the attic, his heart pounding as he carefully opened the first journal. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, perhaps details of Sarah's early years or reflections on her life before they met. But what he found was far more revealing than he had anticipated. The entries started innocently enough, with Sarah recounting her days in college, her dreams for the future, and the excitement of falling in love for the first time. But as Michael read on, the tone shifted. The entries became darker, more introspective, as Sarah began to write about her relationship with David, the man who would later become the father of her child. "I'm so confused," one entry read. "I love David, but there's a part of me that feels trapped. I don't know if I'm ready for this, if I'm ready for the life he wants for us. Sometimes I think about leaving, about starting over somewhere else. But how can I just walk away?" Michael's heart clenched as he read those words. He had never known that Sarah had felt that way about David. To him, their relationship had always seemed like a thing of the past, something that had ended before Sarah had met him. But now, reading her words, it was clear that the relationship had been far more complicated than he had ever realized. He flipped through the pages, reading entry after entry about Sarah's inner turmoil, her love for David, her fear of commitment, and the growing sense of doubt that had plagued her in the months leading up to her pregnancy with Ella. Then, Michael reached an entry that stopped him cold. "I don't know what to do. I'm pregnant, and I'm terrified. David wants to be involved, but I don't know if that's the right thing. We're not ready. I'm not ready. And what if this changes everything? What if this ruins our future?" Michael's hands shook as he read those words, the weight of Sarah's fear and uncertainty pressing down on him. She had been pregnant with Ella, unsure of what to do, unsure of whether David should be a part of her life, and ultimately she had decided to keep it all a secret. But why? What had driven her to make such a drastic choice? Michael continued reading, desperate for answers, and finally, in an entry dated just a few weeks before she had met him, he found what he was looking for. "I've made up my mind. I'm leaving. David doesn't understand, but I can't stay. I can't bring this child into a life of chaos and uncertainty. I need to start over, to build something new. I'll never forget what we had, but I have to think about what's best for this baby. Maybe one day she'll understand. Maybe one day I'll be able to explain." Tears welled in Michael's eyes as he read those words. Sarah hadn't kept Ella a secret because she didn't love her. She had done it because she was afraid that her relationship with David and the life they had built together wasn't stable enough to raise a child. She had made the decision to leave, to protect Ella from a future she believed would be filled with chaos and uncertainty. And then she had met Michael. Later that evening, Michael sat down with Ella, the journals spread out in front of them. He had called her earlier in the day, explaining that he had found something, something important, and that they needed to talk. Ella had arrived with a mix of curiosity and apprehension, her face still etched with the pain of the revelations they had uncovered in the days before. "I found these," Michael said softly, handing the journals to Ella. They were Sarah's. She wrote about everything, about her relationship with David, about her decision to keep you a secret. Ella looked down at the journals, her hands trembling as she opened the first one. Her eyes scanned the pages, her expression a mixture of sadness and understanding. For the first time, she was reading her mother's own words, words that explained the choices that had shaped her life, even before she was born. "I had no idea," Ella whispered, her voice breaking as she read. "She must have been so scared." Michael nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of Sarah's pain. "She was," he said quietly. "She didn't want you to grow up in a life filled with uncertainty. She thought she was doing what was best for you." Ella wiped away a tear, her gaze still fixed on the pages in front of her. "It's hard to be angry at her now," she admitted. "I spent so long feeling abandoned, but now I see that she was just trying to protect me." Michael reached out, placing a comforting hand on Ella's shoulder. "She loved you," he said gently. "She loved you enough to make the hardest decision a mother could make." Ella nodded, her eyes filling with tears as she looked up at Michael. "Thank you for finding this," she whispered. "I don't know if it makes everything better, but it helps." Michael smiled softly, his own eyes brimming with emotion. "We'll figure this out together," he said. "There's still a lot to process, but at least now we have some answers." For the first time in what felt like forever, the weight of the past began to lift. There were still wounds to heal, still truths to confront, but now they had a way forward. Sarah's choices, while painful, were no longer a mystery. And with that understanding came the possibility of closure. As the fire crackled in the hearth and the evening wore on, Michael and Ella sat together, their bond stronger than ever. It wasn't just about blood, it was about love, about trust, and about the willingness to face the truth, no matter how hard it might be. The discovery of Sarah's journals had brought a sense of clarity to the chaos that had taken over Michael's life. While the pain of the revelation still lingered, there was something comforting about finally understanding the reasoning behind Sarah's decisions. The weight of not knowing, of feeling abandoned by the woman he had loved so deeply, had begun to lift. He now understood that her choices were born out of fear and love, not betrayal. Ella, too, had found a measure of peace in her mother's words. As difficult as it had been to learn that her life had been shaped by secrets and hidden decisions, the journals had given her a glimpse into her mother's heart. For the first time, she could see Sarah not as the distant figure who had given her up, but as a woman struggling to do what she believed was best for her child. The anger and resentment that had lived inside Ella for so long were slowly being replaced by a more complex understanding. Still, despite the answers they had found, the road ahead was far from clear. Michael and Ella had made significant strides in mending their relationship, but there were still lingering questions about the past, about David, and about what the future would hold for their new, fragile family. It was a crisp fall afternoon when Michael decided to visit Sarah's grave. He hadn't been there in months, and the thought of standing before her gravestone after everything that had come to light filled him with a mix of trepidation and resolve. He needed to confront the emotions that had been swirling inside him since the truth had been uncovered, the love, the betrayal, the sorrow, and the forgiveness. He invited Ella to come with him. At first, she was hesitant, unsure of whether she was ready to face her mother's memory so soon after discovering the journals, but eventually she agreed. She, too, needed to find closure in the only way she could, by saying goodbye to the woman who had given her life but had never been able to be a part of it. They drove to the cemetery in silence, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. Liam was with a sitter, giving Ella the space she needed to focus on her own healing. As they pulled up to the small, peaceful cemetery, the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the rows of headstones. Michael and Ella walked side by side through the quiet cemetery, their footsteps crunching on the gravel path. When they reached Sarah's grave, they stood in silence for a moment, taking in the sight of her name etched into the stone, Sarah Jones, beloved wife and mother. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Michael stared at the gravestone, his heart aching with the memories of the woman he had loved so deeply, the woman he had built his life around. There was a part of him that still struggled to reconcile the Sarah he had known with the woman who had kept so much hidden. But now, standing before her grave, he realized that he didn't need to have all the answers. He didn't need to understand every decision she had made. "I forgive you," Michael whispered, his voice barely audible. Ella glanced at him, her eyes softening as she saw the emotion on his face. She reached out and took his hand, offering him silent support as they stood together before the woman who had shaped both of their lives in such profound ways. After a few moments, Ella stepped forward, kneeling beside the gravestone. She placed a small bouquet of flowers at the base of the stone, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the blooms. Her voice was quiet but steady when she finally spoke. "I wish I could have known you," Ella said softly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I spent so many years wondering why you left me, why you never came back. And now that I know, I understand. I understand that you were scared, that you thought you were doing what was best for me, but it still hurts. It hurts that we never had a chance to know each other." Michael's heart broke at the vulnerability in Ella's voice. She had been through so much, more than anyone should ever have to endure, and yet she was standing here, confronting the pain with a strength that he deeply admired. "I'm not angry anymore," Ella continued, her voice trembling slightly. I just wish things had been different, but I want you to know that I forgive you too. I forgive you for the choices you made, even though they hurt, and I hope you found peace." As she finished speaking, a single tear slid down her cheek, and she wiped it away with the back of her hand. Michael stepped forward, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. Together, they stood in silence, letting the moment wash over them. After a while, Michael spoke again, his voice filled with a quiet resolve. "I loved her," he said softly. "Despite everything, I loved her with all my heart, and I think she loved us both in the only way she knew how." Ella nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I think you're right," she whispered. They lingered at the grave for a few more minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. There was a sense of finality to the moment, but also a sense of renewal. They had both been carrying the weight of Sarah's choices for so long, but now they could finally begin to let go. In the days that followed, life began to settle into a new kind of normal. Ella continued to visit Michael regularly, and they slowly rebuilt their relationship, one step at a time. Michael found himself growing more attached to Liam, the little boy who had brought so much light into his life during such a dark time. Watching Liam grow, laugh, and play reminded Michael of the importance of family, the family he had now, not the one he had lost. But despite the progress they were making, there was still one unresolved issue hanging over their heads: David. Michael hadn't spoken to David since the day he had revealed the truth about Ella's parentage. The anger and betrayal Michael had felt during that conversation still simmered beneath the surface. But now, with the clarity provided by Sarah's journals, Michael felt that it was time to confront David again. This time, not out of anger, but out of a need for closure. One evening, after much thought, Michael called David. His heart raced as the phone rang, each second feeling longer than the last. Finally, David answered, his voice cautious. "Michael, we need to talk," Michael said, his voice firm but calm. There was a pause on the other end. Then David sighed. "I figured this day would come." "When?" "Tomorrow," Michael replied. "At the house," David agreed, and after hanging up the phone, Michael leaned back in his chair, letting out a deep breath. Tomorrow's conversation wouldn't be easy, but it was necessary. They needed to clear the air once and for all, to face the truth head-on, and to find a way to move forward. The next day, David arrived at Michael's house in the late afternoon. The tension between them was palpable as they sat down in the living room, the weight of the years of friendship and the secrets that had unraveled it hanging heavily in the air. Michael was the first to speak. "I've read Sarah's journals," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I know why she kept Ella a secret. I know why she made the choices she did." David looked surprised but remained silent, waiting for Michael to continue. "She was scared," Michael continued, his voice softening. "She was afraid that bringing a child into her life with you wasn't the right decision, and when she met me, she thought starting over was the best way to protect Ella." David's eyes filled with sorrow as he listened, and for a moment he didn't speak. When he finally did, his voice was thick with emotion. "I always wondered if that's what it was," he admitted. "I loved her, Michael. I loved her more than anything, but I wasn't the man she needed me to be." Michael nodded, understanding the weight of David's words. "She made her choice," he said quietly, "and we've both had to live with the consequences. But I think it's time we stop holding on to the past." David looked up, his eyes filled with regret. "I'm sorry, Michael," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "for everything." Michael took a deep breath, letting the words sink in. He had spent so long feeling angry, feeling betrayed, but now, with the truth laid bare, he realized that forgiveness was the only way forward. He couldn't change the past, but he could choose to let go of the pain. "I forgive you," Michael said softly. "And I hope you can forgive yourself." David nodded, his eyes brimming with unshed tears. "Thank you," he whispered. For the first time in years, the weight of the past began to lift. There were still wounds that needed time to heal, but with forgiveness came the possibility of peace. And for Michael, peace was something he had been chasing for far too long. The weight of forgiveness lingered in the air after David's departure. Michael stood at the front window of his house, watching his old friend walk down the driveway. David's head was bowed, his shoulders slumped as though the years of guilt he had carried had finally started to ease. Michael understood that feeling well. There had been a profound release in finally confronting the truth, in letting go of the anger and betrayal that had consumed him for so long. But as the tension with David began to dissipate, another question loomed large in Michael's mind. What happens now? His life had been upended by secrets that had shattered his sense of who he was and what his family meant. But in the midst of the turmoil, there had also been moments of connection, of healing. His relationship with Ella was growing stronger each day, and Liam, with his innocent smile and boundless curiosity, had brought a sense of purpose back into Michael's life. Still, the road ahead was far from clear. Michael knew that healing wasn't a straight line. There would be difficult conversations to come and painful emotions to navigate. But for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face whatever came next. The next morning, Michael sat in his living room, his thoughts wandering as he sipped his coffee. The house was unusually quiet, almost too quiet without the usual sounds of Liam's laughter or Ella's soft chatter. It was a peaceful moment, but also a reflective one. Michael realized that he had spent so much time dealing with the revelations of the past that he hadn't fully considered what the future might look like. A knock on the door broke through his thoughts. Michael rose from his chair, surprised to find Ella standing on the other side, Liam bundled up in her arms. She looked tired but determined, her eyes holding a quiet strength that Michael had come to admire. "Hey," she greeted softly, stepping inside. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Michael shook his head with a smile. "You're always welcome here," he replied, his tone warm. "Come in. How's Liam doing?" "He's good," Ella said, adjusting the baby in her arms. "He's been a bit fussy this morning, but I think he's teething." Michael chuckled, remembering the sleepless nights he and Sarah had often talked about wanting when they had dreamed of having children. Now, here he was, stepping into the role of grandfather in a way he'd never anticipated. As they settled into the living room, Ella placed Liam in a small playpen nearby, allowing him to explore his toys while she and Michael talked. For a moment, they sat in companionable silence, both of them taking in the quietness of the moment. But there was an unspoken tension in the air. Michael could sense that Ella had something on her mind. "What's on your mind?" Michael asked gently, not wanting to push, but knowing that Ella was holding something back. Ella sighed softly, her eyes dropping to her hands. "I've been thinking a lot about everything," she admitted. "About what comes next. For us? For Liam." Michael nodded, understanding the weight of her words. They had been through so much together, but the question of the future still hung over them, uncertain and fragile. "I want to be a part of your life, Ella," Michael said earnestly, leaning forward slightly. "Whatever happens next, I want you to know that I'm here for you, for both of you." Ella smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in her expression. "I know," she said softly, "and I'm so grateful for that, but, Michael prompted, sensing the hesitation in her voice. Ella took a deep breath, her gaze flickering toward Liam, who was happily chewing on a toy in the corner. "But I don't know what that looks like yet," she admitted. "I've spent so much of my life trying to figure out where I belong, who I am, and now that I've found you, it's still complicated." Michael's heart ached at her words. He could see the weight of uncertainty in her eyes, the same uncertainty that had plagued him in the days since David's confession. He wanted to reassure her, to tell her that everything would work out, but he knew that it wasn't that simple. "We don't have to figure it all out right now," Michael said gently. "We can take things one step at a time." Ella nodded, though her expression remained pensive. "I know," she said quietly, "but I keep thinking about Liam, about what kind of life I want for him, and I can't help but wonder if staying here, staying in this city, is what's best for him." Michael's heart sank. He had grown so accustomed to having Ella and Liam in his life that the thought of them leaving hadn't even crossed his mind. "Are you thinking about moving?" he asked, his voice tight with emotion. Ella hesitated before nodding slowly. "I've been considering it," she admitted. "Not right away, but eventually. I want Liam to grow up somewhere safe, somewhere where he can have a fresh start, and I don't know if I can give him that here." Michael felt a pang of sadness at the thought of them leaving, but he understood where Ella was coming from. She had spent her entire life searching for stability, for a sense of belonging, and now that she had Liam, she wanted to create the kind of life she had never had, a life free from the weight of the past. "Where would you go?" Michael asked, his voice soft. "I'm not sure yet," Ella replied. "I've been thinking about maybe going somewhere quieter, a smaller town where Liam can grow up with more space to run around. I don't know. It's just an idea." Michael nodded, trying to keep his emotions in check. He wanted to support Ella in whatever decision she made, but the thought of her leaving filled him with a sense of loss that he hadn't expected. He had grown so attached to her and Liam, and the idea of them not being a part of his daily life felt like losing a part of himself all over again. "I'll support whatever decision you make," Michael said finally, though the words were difficult to get out. "But I hope you know that you always have a place here, with me." Ella's eyes filled with emotion, and she reached across the table to take Michael's hand. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know what I would have done without you. I wouldn't have made it through any of this alone." Michael squeezed her hand gently, his heart full of both pride and sadness. "You're stronger than you think," he said softly. "You would have found your way, no matter what. But I'm glad I could be here for you." As they sat together in the quiet of the living room, Michael realized that, for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of the future. Yes, there were still uncertainties. Yes, there were still difficult decisions to be made, but he had learned something important in the months since Ella had come into his life. Family wasn't defined by blood or by circumstance. It was defined by the love and support they gave each other, even in the hardest of times. No matter what happened next, whether Ella chose to stay or to move on, Michael knew that they would always be family. In the weeks that followed, Ella continued to explore her options, visiting different towns and considering where she might want to settle with Liam. Michael, true to his word, supported her every step of the way, though his heart ached at the thought of her leaving. One evening, as they sat together over dinner, Ella turned to him with a smile. "I've made a decision," she said softly. Michael's heart skipped a beat, his fork pausing in midair. "What's that?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm going to stay," Ella said, her smile widening. "At least for now. I realized that what I've been looking for isn't a new place, it's a sense of home. And I've found that here, with you." Michael felt a rush of relief and happiness flood through him. He hadn't realized just how much he had been holding his breath, waiting for her decision. "I'm glad," he said softly, his voice filled with emotion. "I'm really glad." Ella reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "You've given me more than I ever could have hoped for," she whispered. "And I want Liam to grow up knowing that he has a family who loves him." Michael smiled, his heart full as he looked at Ella, the daughter he had never known he had, but whom he loved with all his heart. "We're in this together," he said, his voice steady with the weight of the promise. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it as a family." And for the first time in a long time, Michael felt like he had found his place in the world, right where he belonged. Weeks passed after Ella's decision to stay, and life began to settle into a new rhythm for both her and Michael. It wasn't the same as before. Too much had changed, and there were still moments of quiet reflection and unresolved emotions, but there was a growing sense of stability between them. They spent more time together, both with Liam and on their own, rebuilding the trust and connection that had been so suddenly shaken by the revelations of the past. For Michael, the relief of knowing Ella and Liam were staying close was overwhelming. He had been bracing himself for the possibility of their departure, for the hole it would leave in his life. But now, knowing that they were here to stay, at least for the foreseeable future, gave him the peace he hadn't realized he was missing. His mornings were now filled with the sounds of Liam's giggles, his afternoons with quiet conversations with Ella, and his evenings with the warm comfort of knowing that he wasn't alone anymore. Despite this newfound sense of stability, there was still one unresolved piece of the puzzle that weighed on Michael's mind: David. Although their conversation had ended in forgiveness, it had also left an emptiness, a fracture in their relationship that hadn't yet been healed. Michael knew that if he wanted to fully move on, he needed to find a way to close that chapter for good. One Friday afternoon, as Michael sat in his office, going over some paperwork for the company he'd long since handed over to his business partners, his thoughts kept drifting to David. Their friendship had been more than just casual. David had been a fixture in Michael's life for years, long before the truth about Ella had come to light. And while he could forgive David for what had happened, Michael wasn't sure he could ever rebuild the trust that had been broken. Just as Michael was about to close his laptop for the day, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, surprised to see David's name. It had been weeks since their last conversation, and Michael hadn't expected to hear from him again so soon. After a moment's hesitation, Michael answered. "David," he greeted, his voice neutral but calm. "Michael," David replied, his tone careful, as if he wasn't sure how his call would be received. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since we last talked. I know things between us will never be the same, but I wanted to reach out. I was hoping maybe we could meet again. There's still more I want to say." Michael was silent for a moment, considering David's request. Part of him wanted to say no, to let the distance between them remain. But another part of him, the part that had spent years valuing their friendship, felt that it was worth hearing David out. "All right," Michael said after a brief pause. "Let's meet." The next afternoon, Michael met David at a small cafe on the Upper West Side. It was a quiet place, tucked away from the busy streets, the kind of place they used to go to when they were younger, before life had become so complicated. As Michael walked inside, he saw David sitting at a corner table, his face drawn and tired. David stood as Michael approached, offering a tentative smile. "Thanks for coming," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and apprehension. Michael nodded, taking a seat across from him. "I wasn't sure I would," he admitted, his tone honest but not unkind. "But I think we both need to finish this conversation." David nodded, his expression serious. "You're right. There's a lot I didn't say last time, and I think it's important that you hear it." Michael leaned back in his chair, his eyes steady on David. "Go on." David took a deep breath, his gaze dropping to his hands as he spoke. "I know I hurt you, Michael. I know that keeping Ella's true parentage a secret was wrong, and I've spent years regretting it. But what you need to understand is that I wasn't just protecting myself, I was trying to protect you, too." Michael frowned, unsure of what David meant. "Protect me? How?" "When Sarah decided to leave me and start over, she was terrified," David explained, his voice soft but filled with emotion. "She didn't just want to leave the relationship, she wanted to leave behind everything that had come with it, including me. She thought that if you knew the truth about Ella, it would destroy the life she was trying to build with you. And I agreed to keep it a secret because I didn't want to lose her either." Michael's chest tightened at the memory of Sarah, the woman he had loved, the woman he had built a life with, struggling with fears he hadn't known she had carried. "You were both afraid," he said quietly, understanding beginning to dawn on him. David nodded. "We were, and that fear made us do things we shouldn't have done. But I never stopped caring about you, Michael. Even when I knew I was doing the wrong thing, I didn't want to hurt you. I just didn't know how to make it right without losing everything." Michael was silent for a moment, absorbing David's words. The anger that had once burned so brightly inside him had dimmed to a dull ache, replaced by a deeper understanding of the complexity of the situation. Both Sarah and David had been trapped in a web of fear and regret, and while their choices had hurt him, he could see now that it hadn't been out of malice. "I get it," Michael said finally, his voice steady. "I understand why you did what you did, but it doesn't make it any easier." David nodded, his eyes filled with remorse. "I know. I don't expect things to go back to the way they were, but I needed you to know the truth. I needed you to know that it wasn't about betraying you. It was about trying to survive." Michael sat back, letting out a deep breath. "I appreciate you telling me this, David. I really do. But I think we both know that things between us will never be the same." David's face fell, but he nodded in acceptance. "I know," he said quietly. "I just hope that, in time, we can find a way to be something, even if it's not what we used to be." Michael considered David's words, and for the first time since the truth had come to light, he felt a sense of closure. He didn't know if they would ever rebuild the friendship they had once had, but he knew that they could move forward, if not as close friends, then at least as two men who had finally come to terms with the past. "We'll see," Michael said, offering a small but genuine smile. "Time will tell." David smiled back, a look of relief washing over his face. It wasn't the resolution either of them had hoped for, but it was enough for now. After parting ways with David, Michael returned home feeling lighter than he had in months. He knew there was still a long road ahead, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was moving in the right direction. When he walked through the front door, he was greeted by the sound of Liam's laughter from the living room. Michael smiled as he made his way inside, finding Ella on the floor with Liam, playing with a set of colorful blocks. The sight filled him with a warmth he hadn't known he needed. "Hey," Ella greeted, glancing up at him with a smile. "How did it go with David?" Michael sat down beside her, watching as Liam gleefully knocked over a tower of blocks. "It went well," he said simply. "We talked. There's still a lot to process, but I think we both found some peace." Ella nodded, her eyes softening with understanding. "That's good," she said quietly. "I'm glad. They sat together in silence for a few moments, watching as Liam continued to play. Michael reached out, gently brushing a stray curl from Liam's forehead, feeling a sense of contentment wash over him. "I think we're going to be okay," Michael said softly, his voice filled with quiet conviction. Ella smiled, her eyes filled with gratitude and hope. "I think so, too." As the evening wore on and the sun dipped below the horizon, Michael felt a deep sense of peace settle in his heart. The wounds of the past were beginning to heal, and the future, uncertain as it was, held the promise of new beginnings. And for the first time in a long time, Michael felt ready to embrace whatever came next. The sun had barely risen when Michael found himself awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee in hand. The house was quiet. Ella and Liam were still asleep in their rooms, but Michael's mind was already racing with thoughts of the day ahead. The conversation with David had left him with a strange sense of calm, but it had also stirred something deeper within him. For months, his focus had been on uncovering the truth, on untangling the web of secrets that Sarah and David had woven. But now, with so many of those mysteries finally laid bare, Michael found himself confronting a different challenge, rebuilding his sense of identity and trust in the people around him. The past few weeks had been about survival, about processing revelations and dealing with the emotional fallout. But now, Michael felt like it was time to start moving forward. He had lost so much over the years: his wife, the certainty of his place in Ella's life, even some of his oldest friendships. But he had gained something too. He had gained a daughter, a grandson, and the opportunity to forge a new kind of family, one built not on blood, but on choice. Michael glanced at the hallway, hearing soft footsteps as Ella emerged from her room, carrying a sleepy Liam in her arms. She smiled at him as she approached the kitchen, setting Liam down in his high chair while she grabbed a mug for herself. "Morning," Ella said, her voice still hushed from sleep. "Morning," Michael replied, his tone warm. "How'd you sleep?" Ella shrugged, a small smile tugging at her lips. "About as well as you can with a teething baby," she joked, though there was a glint of exhaustion in her eyes. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down across from Michael, her gaze softening as she looked at him. "You've been up early a lot lately," Ella noted, her voice curious but not pressing. Michael nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. "Yeah, I've had a lot on my mind," he admitted. "I've been thinking about everything, about how far we've come and where we go from here." Ella's smile faded slightly, replaced by a more thoughtful expression. "I've been thinking about that too," she said quietly. "We've been through so much, and sometimes it feels like we're still finding our way." Michael nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. There were days when things felt almost normal, when they fell into an easy routine, sharing meals and taking care of Liam. But there were also moments when the weight of the past hung over them, reminding them of the secrets and betrayals that had nearly torn their lives apart. "I know it hasn't been easy," Michael said softly, "and I know there's still a lot we need to figure out, but I want you to know that I'm committed to this, to us, to being a family." Ella looked down at her coffee, her fingers tracing the rim of the mug. "I know," she whispered, "and I feel the same way, but sometimes I wonder if we can ever really move past everything that's happened." Michael frowned, his heart aching at the vulnerability in her voice. "Do you feel like you can't trust me?" he asked gently, though the question stung more than he expected. Ella's eyes widened, and she quickly shook her head. "No, it's not that," she said, her voice full of reassurance. "It's not about you, Michael. It's about me. I've spent so much of my life not trusting anyone, keeping people at a distance because I didn't want to get hurt. And now that I have you and Liam, I'm scared. I'm scared of losing you, of things falling apart again." Michael reached across the table, taking Ella's hand in his. "You're not going to lose me," he said firmly. "We've already been through the worst, and we're still here. We'll get through this too, together." Ella's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, and she squeezed his hand tightly. "I hope so," she whispered, "because I don't think I could do this without you." Michael's heart swelled with emotion, and he gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. "You won't have to," he promised. "We'll make this work, Ella. I'm not going anywhere." They sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of their shared emotions hanging in the air. Liam, oblivious to the tension, babbled happily in his high chair, his chubby hands grasping at a small toy. His innocent joy was a reminder of why they were both fighting so hard to rebuild their lives, because they wanted to give him the love and stability they had both been denied. Later that afternoon, Michael found himself in the park with Liam, pushing the stroller along the tree-lined path while the crisp autumn air filled his lungs. Ella had stayed behind at the house to take care of some errands, and Michael had volunteered to take Liam out for a walk, eager to spend some quality time with his grandson. As they strolled through the park, Michael's mind drifted back to his conversation with Ella that morning. He had known that trust would be difficult to rebuild after everything they had been through, but hearing Ella voice her fears had brought the reality of the situation into sharper focus. It wasn't just about moving past the lies, it was about learning how to trust again, how to build something new out of the ashes of their fractured lives. As he watched Liam kick his legs happily in the stroller, Michael realized that he had been given a second chance. He had lost so much when Sarah died, and for years he had lived in the shadow of that loss, convinced that he would never have the family he had always dreamed of. But now, with Ella and Liam in his life, he had the opportunity to start over, to build the kind of family he had always wanted, one built on love, on honesty, and on trust. Michael wasn't naive enough to think that it would be easy. There would be challenges ahead, moments of doubt and fear, but he also knew that they had already survived the worst. They had faced the truth together, and now they were stronger for it. As they continued their walk, Michael couldn't help but smile as Liam giggled and babbled at the birds flitting through the trees. This little boy had brought so much light into his life, and for that, Michael was endlessly grateful. That evening, as the sun set and the house grew quiet, Michael sat in the living room with Ella, their conversation from the morning still lingering in his mind. They had spent the day going about their usual routine, but there was a quiet understanding between them, a recognition that they were both still figuring out what their new life together would look like. "I've been thinking," Michael said softly, breaking the comfortable silence between them. Ella looked up from the book she had been reading, her expression curious. "About what?" "About us," Michael replied, his voice thoughtful. "About how we move forward." Ella nodded, setting the book aside as she turned her full attention to him. "I've been thinking about that too," she admitted. Michael took a deep breath, his heart racing as he prepared to voice the thoughts that had been swirling in his mind all day. "I think we need to rebuild trust," he said slowly. "Not just between us, but in ourselves. We've been through so much, and I know that the scars from the past won't heal overnight. But I think if we're going to make this work, if we're going to build a life together, we need to be honest with each other about everything." Ella's eyes softened, and she nodded in agreement. "I think you're right," she said quietly. "We've spent so much time dealing with the fallout from the secrets that were kept from us, but we haven't really talked about how we move forward, about how we build something new." Michael smiled, relieved that they were on the same page. "Exactly," he said. "I don't want to make the same mistakes Sarah and David did. I want to be open with you, and I want you to feel like you can be open with me." Ella's expression grew thoughtful, and she nodded slowly. "I want that too," she said softly. "I want to trust you, and I want to learn how to trust myself again." Michael reached out, taking her hand in his. "We'll figure it out," he promised. "One step at a time." Ella smiled, her eyes filled with a quiet hope. "One step at a time," she repeated, her voice full of determination. As the evening wore on and the house grew still, Michael felt a sense of peace settle over him. There was still work to be done, still wounds to heal and bridges to rebuild, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like they were finally on the right path. And that, he realized, was enough. The days that followed Michael and Ella's conversation were filled with a quiet determination to rebuild their relationship. They hadn't explicitly planned it, but the desire to move forward was present in every small gesture, every shared moment. It wasn't about grand declarations or sweeping changes. It was about the small, consistent steps they took together. They were learning to trust again, each other and themselves. Michael felt the shift more acutely with each passing day. The awkwardness that had initially existed between them had begun to fade, replaced by a sense of comfort. The tension that had hung in the air after the revelations about Sarah and David was slowly dissipating, and in its place was a fragile but growing bond. The process wasn't without its challenges. There were moments when old wounds reopened, when doubts crept in, and both of them had to remind themselves that healing wasn't linear. It took time and patience, but they were both committed to making it work, for themselves and for Liam. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, Michael came home to find Ella sitting on the living room floor with Liam, laughing as he toddled around, his chubby legs still wobbly as he attempted to walk. The sight of them, so full of life and joy, filled Michael with an overwhelming sense of gratitude. This was what he had longed for: a family, a home, and a life built on love. "Look who's almost walking," Ella called out with a smile, gesturing toward Liam, who was holding onto the edge of the couch for balance. Michael chuckled, setting his briefcase down and joining them on the floor. "He's getting stronger every day," he said, reaching out to ruffle Liam's hair. "Won't be long before we're chasing him all over the house." Ella laughed, her eyes sparkling with warmth. "I know. I'm not sure if I'm ready for that." They sat together, watching Liam as he continued to explore his newfound independence, his tiny feet pattering across the floor with increasing confidence. There was something peaceful about the moment, something that felt right. For the first time in a long time, Michael felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. As the evening wore on and Liam eventually drifted off to sleep, Ella and Michael found themselves sitting on the couch, the quiet of the house settling around them. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the room, and Michael couldn't help but feel that they were finally finding their rhythm as a family. "You know," Ella began, her voice thoughtful, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said the other day. About rebuilding trust." Michael turned to her, nodding for her to continue. "I think we're doing it," she said softly. "I mean, it's not perfect, and there are still moments when I wonder if I'm strong enough to let my guard down completely, but we're trying, and I think that's what matters." Michael smiled, his heart swelling with pride for how far they had come. "You are strong enough," he said gently. "We both are, and you're right. It's not about being perfect. It's about showing up, day after day, and choosing each other." Ella's eyes shimmered with emotion as she looked at him, her expression softening. "Thank you, Michael," she whispered, "for everything, for being here, for supporting me, for loving Liam like he's your own." Michael's throat tightened with emotion. "He is my own," he said quietly, "just like you are." Ella's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of Michael's words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. It was a reminder of how far they had come, of the bond they had forged through the trials and heartbreak they had faced. "I'm so lucky to have you," Ella whispered, her voice breaking slightly. Michael shook his head, his own emotions threatening to spill over. "No, Ella," he said softly. "I'm the lucky one." The next morning, Michael awoke to the smell of coffee brewing and the sound of Liam's giggles drifting down the hall. He smiled to himself as he got out of bed, the familiar routine of their mornings together bringing him a sense of peace he hadn't realized he was missing. There was a time, not so long ago, when he had felt lost, adrift in a life that no longer made sense after Sarah's death. But now, with Ella and Liam, he felt like he had a purpose again. As he walked into the kitchen, he found Ella at the stove, flipping pancakes while Liam sat in his high chair, eagerly munching on a piece of toast. The sight filled Michael with a deep sense of contentment. This was his family now, one that was different from what he had imagined, but one that he cherished all the same. "Morning," Ella greeted with a smile, glancing over her shoulder as Michael entered the room. "Morning," he replied, leaning down to kiss the top of Liam's head. "Smells good in here." Ella grinned, flipping the last pancake onto a plate. "Thought I'd make breakfast this morning. Figured we could all use a little treat." Michael chuckled, grabbing a cup of coffee from the pot. "You're spoiling us." Ella laughed, her eyes twinkling. "Maybe just a little." They sat down together at the table, the warmth of the morning sun filtering through the windows as they shared breakfast. There was an ease between them that hadn't existed before, a sense of comfort that came from knowing that they were both committed to building a life together. "I've been thinking," Ella said after a while, her tone thoughtful. "Maybe we should plan a trip, just the three of us." Michael raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "A trip? Where to?" Ella shrugged, a smile playing at the corners of her lips. "I don't know yet. Maybe somewhere quiet? A small town upstate or by the beach. I just think it could be nice for us to get away for a little while, spend some time together as a family." Michael smiled, liking the idea more and more. "That sounds perfect," he said. "I think we could all use a change of scenery." Ella's smile widened, and she nodded in agreement. "I'll start looking into it. Then..." As the days passed and their plans for the trip began to take shape, Michael couldn't help but feel a growing sense of excitement. It wasn't just about the trip itself, it was about what the trip represented. It was a chance for them to build new memories, to create a foundation for their future together. One evening, as Michael sat with Liam on the floor, helping him stack blocks into a wobbly tower, he found himself reflecting on how far they had come. There had been a time when he had thought that his life was over, that the loss of Sarah and the secrets that followed would leave him broken forever. But now, he realized that life had given him a second chance, a chance to love, to connect, and to build something new. As Liam giggled and knocked the tower of blocks over, Michael laughed along with him, his heart full. He glanced up to see Ella standing in the doorway, watching them with a soft smile on her face. The warmth in her eyes mirrored the emotions swirling in Michael's chest. "Come join us," Michael called out, patting the space beside him. Ella smiled and made her way over, sitting down beside them as Liam clambered into her lap. They sat together, the three of them, as the evening stretched on, basking in the simple joy of being together. Michael knew there would still be challenges ahead. Life was never without its difficulties, and the wounds from the past would take time to fully heal. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of what the future might hold. He had his family, his daughter, his grandson, and that was enough. As the night wore on and the house grew quiet, Michael sat in the living room, watching the fire crackle in the hearth. Ella had taken Liam to bed, and the stillness of the house gave him time to reflect. He thought of Sarah, of the love they had shared and the pain of losing her. He thought of David, of the friendship they had lost, and the fragile peace they had managed to find. But most of all, he thought of Ella and Liam, the future he was building with them, and the life they would create together. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't what he had imagined all those years ago, but it was real, and it was his. Michael sat in the stillness of the night, watching the fire flicker and fade. He thought about how much had changed over the past year, how many times his life had been turned upside down, only to reveal something new beneath the wreckage. He had lost Sarah, learned about Ella, and confronted truths that had once seemed too painful to bear. And yet, here he was, surrounded by a family he had never expected, finding joy and purpose in the small, quiet moments of their everyday life. The trip they were planning felt like a new beginning, a chance to leave behind the weight of the past and focus on the future. A future that wasn't defined by the secrets and lies that had once cast a shadow over everything, but by the love and connection they were building every day. The next morning, after breakfast, Ella brought up the trip again. "I was thinking," she began, her voice bright with enthusiasm, "about maybe going to the Catskills. There are some beautiful cabins up there, and it's not too far of a drive." Michael smiled, the thought of spending time in the mountains with Ella and Liam sounding perfect. "That sounds great," he said. "We could rent a cabin for the weekend, get away from the city for a little while." Ella beamed, clearly excited about the idea. "I'll look into it today," she said. "I think it could be really good for us." As they talked more about the trip, Michael couldn't help but feel a sense of hope bubbling up inside him. This was the life he had always wanted, not the one he had planned, but the one he had been given, and he was ready to embrace it. A few days later, they were packed and ready to go. The car was loaded with bags, Liam's favorite toys, and enough snacks to last them through the drive. Ella sat in the passenger seat, her phone in hand, as she navigated their route to the Catskills. Michael felt a sense of excitement as they pulled out of the driveway, the city slowly disappearing in the rearview mirror. The drive was peaceful, the roads winding through the rolling hills of upstate New York as they made their way toward the mountains. Liam dozed off in his car seat, his soft breathing the only sound aside from the hum of the engine. Michael glanced over at Ella, who was looking out the window, a soft smile on her face. "I think this is exactly what we needed," Ella said after a while, her voice full of contentment. "A chance to get away, clear our heads, and just be." Michael nodded, his grip on the steering wheel relaxing. "Yeah," he agreed. "I think so too." As they approached the cabin, nestled among tall trees and overlooking a serene lake, Michael couldn't help but feel a deep sense of peace. The air was crisp, the sky clear, and the world felt quiet in a way that it hadn't in a long time. They spent the weekend hiking, exploring the woods, and sitting by the fireplace in the cozy cabin. The time away gave them a chance to reconnect, to leave behind the noise and distractions of the city and focus on each other. Liam was full of energy, toddling around the cabin and giggling as Michael and Ella chased him through the trees. It was simple, it was peaceful, and it was everything they needed. One evening, as they sat by the lake watching the sunset, Michael turned to Ella, his heart full. "I'm proud of us," he said quietly. Ella looked at him, her eyes shining with emotion. "Me too," she whispered. "We've come so far." They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun dip below the horizon, the sky painted in shades of pink and orange. In that moment, everything felt right. The challenges they had faced, the pain they had endured, it had all led them to this, a new chapter, a new beginning. As the stars began to appear in the night sky, Michael realized something important. Family wasn't just about blood or shared history. It was about love, about the bonds they chose to build, and about the commitment to stand by each other through the good times and the bad. Ella and Liam were his family now, and he would do whatever it took to protect that. When they returned to the city, life resumed its usual rhythm. But there was a difference now. An unspoken understanding between Michael and Ella that they were in this together, fully committed to the life they were building. The trip had solidified something between them, something that had been fragile before, but now felt stronger, more certain. Ella continued her routine of taking care of Liam, and Michael found himself more involved than ever, helping with bedtime, picking Liam up from daycare, and spending evenings playing with him. The more time he spent with his grandson, the deeper his love for the boy grew. He had missed out on the early years with Ella, but with Liam, he had been given a second chance, a chance to be the kind of father figure he had always wanted to be. One evening, as Michael was putting Liam to bed, he realized just how much his life had changed. The loneliness and grief that had once defined his days were now replaced by love and purpose. He had found a family again, even in the most unexpected of ways. After Liam was tucked in and fast asleep, Michael found Ella sitting on the couch, a book in her lap and a soft smile on her face. He sat down beside her, feeling the warmth of her presence, the ease of their connection. "Thank you," Ella said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. Michael frowned, looking at her curiously. "For what?" "For everything," she replied, her voice soft but sincere. "For taking me in, for being there for me and Liam, for just being you." Michael's heart swelled at her words, and he smiled, reaching out to take her hand. "You don't have to thank me," he said gently. "I'm just glad you're here, both of you." Ella smiled, her eyes brimming with gratitude. "We're lucky to have you." Michael shook his head, squeezing her hand. "No, Ella, I'm the lucky one." As they sat together, the fire crackling softly in the background, Michael felt a sense of peace settle over him. The journey hadn't been easy. There had been heartache, betrayal, and loss. But through it all, they had found each other. They had built something new, something strong, and for the first time in a long time, Michael was no longer haunted by the past. The future was theirs, and he was ready to embrace it. In the weeks following their trip to the Catskills, life for Michael, Ella, and Liam found a peaceful rhythm. The time away had helped them reconnect, not just as individuals, but as a family. The tension that had once been present in the quiet moments seemed to have dissipated, replaced by a sense of contentment. Michael felt more settled than he had in years. But as the days went by, there was something that still lingered in the back of his mind: David. While they had confronted the truth and shared their apologies, Michael hadn't spoken to David much since their last meeting. Their conversation had brought a kind of closure, but there were still lingering questions that gnawed at Michael's thoughts. He had accepted David's apology and understood the fear that had driven his decisions. But trust, rebuilding that trust, was a much more complicated matter. Michael knew that if he truly wanted to move forward, he couldn't leave things unresolved with David. Forgiveness had been the first step, but now he needed to find a way to bridge the gap that still existed between them. They had been close for so long, and while Michael wasn't sure their friendship would ever return to what it had been, he couldn't let things end with unanswered questions. One afternoon, after putting Liam down for his nap, Michael sat in the kitchen, his phone resting on the table in front of him. He stared at it for a long time, debating whether or not to make the call. Part of him wanted to leave things as they were, to let the distance remain. But another part of him knew that leaving things unfinished would only weigh on him, casting a shadow over the peace he had worked so hard to build. With a deep breath, Michael picked up the phone and dialed David's number. The phone rang a few times before David answered, his voice sounding surprised but not unfriendly. "Michael," David greeted cautiously. "It's good to hear from you. What's going on?" Michael leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming lightly on the table. "Hey, David, I've been thinking a lot about our last conversation," he began. "I think we still have some things to talk about. Are you free to meet up?" David was quiet for a moment, and Michael could almost hear the hesitation in his voice. "Yeah," David said after a pause. "I think we should talk. When and where?" They agreed to meet at a small coffee shop later that afternoon, the same place where they had confronted each other weeks ago. As Michael hung up the phone, he felt a knot of tension form in his chest. This conversation wasn't going to be easy, but he knew it was necessary. When Michael arrived at the coffee shop, David was already there, sitting at a corner table with a cup of coffee in front of him. Michael approached, nodding a greeting as he slid into the seat across from him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was heavy with unspoken words, the weight of their history pressing down on the small space. It was David who finally broke the silence. "I've been waiting for this," David admitted, his voice low but steady. "I knew we weren't done." Michael nodded, taking a sip of the coffee the waitress had brought over. "I guess I've been avoiding it," he said honestly. "I wasn't sure what to say or how to feel, but I know we can't leave things unfinished." David sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I get it. It's not easy to face all of this. The things I did, the secrets Sarah and I kept, it wasn't fair to you, and I don't expect you to just move past it." Michael looked at David, searching his face for some sign of the man he had once considered a close friend. He had known David for years, trusted him, relied on him, and yet the betrayal had cut so deep. "It's not just about moving past it," Michael said slowly. "It's about figuring out what's left, if we can even rebuild anything after everything that's happened." David nodded, his expression grim. I don't know if we can, he admitted. I've spent a lot of time thinking about it, and I don't know if things will ever go back to the way they were. But I want to try. Even if it's not the same, I don't want to lose you completely. Michael leaned back in his chair, considering David's words. He had always believed that trust, once broken, was nearly impossible to fully restore. But now, sitting here with David, he realized that what they had wasn't just about trust. It was about history, about shared experiences that had shaped them both. They had been through so much together, and while things had fallen apart, there was still something worth salvaging. I don't think we can go back to how things were, Michael said carefully. Too much has happened. But that doesn't mean we can't move forward. David looked relieved, his posture relaxing slightly. I'd like that, he said quietly. I know I messed things up, and I know it'll take time, but I'm willing to put in the work, whatever that looks like. Michael nodded, appreciating David's honesty. It wasn't about fixing everything all at once. It was about taking small steps, just as he had done with Ella. I think that's all we can do, Michael said. Take it one day at a time. I can't promise that things will ever be the same, but I'm willing to try. For the first time in months, the tension between them seemed to ease. They sat in silence for a few moments, both of them processing what had been said. Michael knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be moments of doubt, moments when the old wounds would resurface. But he also knew that he didn't want to walk away from the friendship completely. David smiled, a genuine expression of gratitude on his face. Thank you, he said softly. I don't deserve it, but thank you. Michael shook his head. It's not about what we deserve, he replied. It's about what we need. And I think we both need to figure out what comes next. Later that evening, as Michael returned home, he felt a sense of relief. The conversation with David hadn't solved everything, but it had opened the door to the possibility of healing. They weren't the same people they had once been, and their friendship might never return to what it was, but there was a chance for something new, something different, but perhaps stronger because of what they had endured. When Michael walked through the front door, he was greeted by the familiar sounds of Liam's laughter and Ella's soft voice as she played with him in the living room. The sight filled him with a warmth that had become all too familiar lately, the warmth of knowing that he had found his way back to what mattered most. How'd it go? Ella asked as she looked up, her eyes filled with curiosity. Michael smiled, sitting down beside her. It went well, he said. We still have a long way to go, but I think we're finally on the right path. Ella nodded, her expression softening with understanding. I'm glad, she said quietly. I know how much that friendship meant to you. Michael looked at her, his heart swelling with gratitude for the life they were building together. It did, he admitted, but what I have now, with you and Liam, that's what matters most. Ella smiled, her eyes shimmering with emotion. We're lucky to have you, she said softly. Michael shook his head, his own eyes glistening. No, Ella, he whispered. I'm the lucky one. As the evening wore on and the house settled into its usual quiet, Michael found himself reflecting on the journey they had all been through. The pain, the loss, the betrayal, it had all led to this, to a family that was stronger because of the challenges they had faced, to friendships that had been tested but not broken, and to a future that was no longer defined by the mistakes of the past. They were rebuilding, slowly, steadily, but they were moving forward, and for the first time in a long time, Michael felt like he could see the path ahead clearly. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Life had fallen into a comfortable rhythm for Michael, Ella, and Liam. The bond between them was stronger than ever, and the weight of past secrets had begun to ease as they focused on the future. Their home, once filled with uncertainty, now radiated warmth, love, and a sense of security that had once seemed impossible. Michael was deeply invested in their lives, finding joy in Liam's every new milestone and strength in his growing relationship with Ella. However, beneath the surface of their newfound stability, there were still shadows of the past lingering, questions unanswered, emotions unresolved. Michael had taken steps toward repairing his relationship with David, but a part of him knew that healing wasn't complete. He also hadn't fully processed the betrayal he felt towards Sarah. Despite everything he had learned from her journals, there was still a part of him that felt like he had never truly known her. One evening, as Michael sat in his study, his gaze drifting toward the shelf where Sarah's journals now rested, he felt the weight of her absence more acutely than ever. He had forgiven her for the choices she made, but the hollow space in his heart remained. She had been everything to him, and yet he had spent years living in the shadow of secrets that had kept them apart, even in their closest moments. As if sensing his unrest, Ella appeared in the doorway, a concerned look on her face. "You've been quiet all evening," she said softly, stepping into the room. "Is something bothering you?" Michael sighed, running a hand through his hair as he leaned back in his chair. "I've been thinking about Sarah," he admitted, his voice heavy with emotion, "about everything we've been through. I thought I'd come to terms with it, but I don't know. There's still a part of me that feels like I never really knew her." Ella sat down across from him, her expression understanding. "It's hard to reconcile the past when there are still so many unanswered questions," she said gently. "I feel the same way sometimes, like there's so much about her that I'll never fully understand." Michael nodded, his heart aching as he thought about the woman he had loved so deeply. "I loved her with everything I had," he said quietly. "But I can't help but wonder if she ever truly trusted me. If she did, why did she hide so much?" Ella reached across the desk, placing a comforting hand on his. "She loved you, Michael," she said softly. "I've seen it in her journals, in the way she wrote about you. But I think she was scared of losing the life she had built with you if the truth came out." Michael looked at Ella, his heart heavy with the weight of their shared loss. "I guess I just wish I could talk to her," he whispered, "to ask her why she kept it all from me. I'll never have that closure." Ella squeezed his hand gently, her voice filled with empathy. "I know it's hard," she said quietly, "but you've done everything you can to understand her. You've read her words, and you've come to terms with the choices she made. You might never have all the answers, but that doesn't mean you didn't know her. The love you shared was real, Michael. Don't let the secrets overshadow that." Michael sat in silence for a moment, letting Ella's words sink in. She was right, of course. His love for Sarah had been real, and despite the secrets that had come to light, that love had shaped his life in profound ways. He had spent so long focusing on what he didn't know that he had almost forgotten the depth of what they had shared. "I guess I'm still learning how to let go," Michael said softly. Ella nodded, her expression filled with understanding. "We all are," she whispered, "but you don't have to do it alone. We're in this together." Michael smiled, grateful for her support. Over the past few months, Ella had become more than just a daughter to him. She had become his anchor, his connection to the future he was building. Together, they had faced the darkness of the past, and now they were creating something new, something beautiful. "I don't know what I'd do without you," Michael said, his voice thick with emotion. Ella smiled, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "You'll never have to find out," she said softly. As the days passed, Michael found himself growing more at peace with the lingering questions about Sarah. It wasn't about getting all the answers anymore. It was about accepting the parts of her he had never known and cherishing the parts he had. The wounds would always be there, but they no longer defined him. He had learned to live with them. However, just when Michael thought he was finally settling into a sense of normalcy, a new complication arose, one that would challenge everything he had worked so hard to build. It started with a phone call. Michael was sitting in the living room one afternoon, reading through some paperwork for the company, when his phone buzzed on the coffee table. Glancing at the screen, he saw a number he didn't recognize, but something in his gut told him to answer. "Hello?" Michael greeted cautiously. There was a pause on the other end before a woman's voice spoke, tentative but urgent. "Is this Michael Jones?" "Yes," Michael replied, frowning slightly. "Who's calling?" The woman hesitated before responding. "My name is Laura," she said slowly. "I don't know how to say this, but I think I have information about Sarah." Michael's heart stopped, his breath catching in his throat. "What kind of information?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not sure how much you know," Laura continued, her tone gentle but serious. "But I think Sarah may have been involved in something more complicated than you realize." Michael's mind raced as he tried to process the words. After everything that had come to light about Sarah's secrets, the thought that there could be more was almost too much to bear. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice rising with urgency. "I think it would be better if we talked in person," Laura said. There's a lot you need to know, and it's not something I can explain over the phone." Michael's stomach churned as he considered her words. He had spent months coming to terms with Sarah's past, trying to find peace with the choices she had made. The idea that there could be more secrets, more lies, sent a wave of dread washing over him. "Where can we meet?" Michael asked, his voice tight. Laura gave him an address for a cafe on the other side of town. I'll be there tomorrow afternoon," she said. "I know this is a lot, but I think it's important that you hear what I have to say." As Michael hung up the phone, his heart raced with a mix of fear and curiosity. What more could there be? He had thought he had uncovered all of Sarah's secrets. Hadn't the journals revealed everything? But now, a new shadow had emerged, and Michael knew he couldn't ignore it. Whatever this woman had to say, he needed to hear it. That evening, as Michael sat at the dinner table with Ella and Liam, he found it hard to focus. His mind kept drifting back to the phone call, to the ominous words Laura had spoken. He hadn't told Ella yet, hadn't wanted to worry her until he knew more, but the weight of the unknown hung heavy over him. "Everything okay?" Ella asked, her brow furrowing in concern as she noticed his distracted expression. Michael forced a smile, nodding. "Yeah, just thinking about some things." Ella didn't press, but Michael could see the worry in her eyes. He hated keeping things from her, especially after all they had been through, but he needed to find out what Laura had to say before dragging Ella into it. That night, as Michael lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, his thoughts churned with uncertainty. He had worked so hard to rebuild his life after Sarah's death, to find peace in the midst of all the chaos. But now, it felt like the past was creeping back in, threatening to unravel everything once again. Whatever Laura had to say, Michael knew it could change everything, and he wasn't sure he was ready for that. The next day dawned with a sense of tension that Michael couldn't shake. He had barely slept the night before, his mind spinning with possibilities about what Laura might reveal. He had spent so long uncovering Sarah's secrets, confronting the pain they had caused, and working to rebuild his life. The idea that there could be something else, something he had missed, was almost unbearable, but he knew he had to face it, whatever it was. After dropping Liam off at daycare, Michael told Ella he had a meeting across town. He wanted to tell her the truth, to explain what was happening, but something held him back. He didn't want to burden her with this until he had all the facts. Ella had been through enough, and the last thing he wanted was to drag her into more turmoil if it could be avoided. As he drove to the cafe where he was supposed to meet Laura, Michael's thoughts raced. What could this woman possibly know about Sarah that he hadn't already uncovered? Her journals had revealed so much: her relationship with David, her fears, her decision to keep Ella a secret. What more could there be? When he arrived at the cafe, Michael spotted Laura sitting at a small table by the window. She was a woman in her late 40s, with dark hair pulled back into a neat bun and a serious expression on her face. As he approached, she looked up, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "Michael?" she asked as he sat down. "Yes," he replied, his voice steady despite the turmoil churning inside him. "I'm Michael. What's this all about?" Laura glanced around the cafe, as if ensuring they weren't being overheard, before leaning forward slightly. "I know this might come as a shock," she began, her voice low and careful, "but I was a close friend of Sarah's for many years. I'm not sure how much you know about her life before you met, but there are some things I think you deserve to know." Michael's heart skipped a beat. "I've read her journals," he said cautiously. "I know about her past with David, about the secrets she kept. But if you know something else, something I don't, then I need you to tell me." Laura took a deep breath, her eyes filled with sympathy. "There's more," she said quietly. "Sarah didn't just leave David because of their relationship. She left because she was involved in something far more complicated, something she was trying to escape." Michael's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" Laura hesitated, then reached into her bag, pulling out a small, worn envelope. She slid it across the table toward Michael. Before Sarah left David, she was involved in a business venture with him. It wasn't legal, and when things started to unravel, she made the decision to disappear, to start over. She thought it was the only way to protect herself and her future child. Michael stared at the envelope, his hands trembling slightly as he picked it up. "What kind of business are you talking about?" Laura sighed, her expression filled with regret. "David was involved in money laundering," she explained. "It was a small operation at first, but as it grew, it became dangerous. Sarah knew about it, but at first, she wasn't involved. Then as their relationship deepened, she got pulled into it. When she realized how bad things had gotten, she made the choice to leave him and hide the truth from everyone, including you." Michael's mind reeled as he processed the information. Sarah, the woman he had loved, had been involved in criminal activity. It was almost impossible to believe. And yet, as he thought back to the secrets she had kept from him, the fear she had expressed in her journals, it all started to make a twisted kind of sense. She hadn't just been hiding Ella's existence. She had been running from something far darker. "I don't understand," Michael said, his voice hoarse. "Why didn't she tell me? Why did she hide all of this?" "Because she was afraid," Laura replied softly. "Afraid that if you knew, you would leave her, that you would never forgive her for the choices she had made. She thought the only way to protect her new life with you was to keep her past buried." Michael sat back in his chair, his heart pounding in his chest. All these years, he had believed that Sarah's secrets had been about protecting Ella, about her relationship with David. But now, it seemed there had been something far more dangerous lurking beneath the surface. "And David?" Michael asked, his voice tight. "Does he know about this?" Laura shook her head. "I don't think so," she said. "After Sarah left, the operation fell apart. David got out before things could get too messy, and as far as I know, he never tried to reach out to her again. He probably thinks it's all in the past." Michael clenched his fists, anger bubbling up inside him. David had lied to him for years about Ella, about his relationship with Sarah, and now it seemed he had been keeping even more from him. How much more of his life had been built on lies? "What am I supposed to do with this information?" Michael asked, his voice low and controlled. Laura met his gaze, her expression serious. "I'm telling you because I think you deserve to know the full truth," she said. "You've been living with half the story for too long. What you do with it is up to you. But I thought you should have all the facts." Michael stared at the envelope in his hands, his mind spinning with the weight of what he had just learned. He had spent so long trying to understand Sarah, to reconcile the love he had for her with the secrets she had kept. And now it seemed there was still more to uncover, more to process. "Thank you for telling me," Michael said quietly, though his mind was still reeling. "I appreciate it." Laura nodded, her expression softening. "I know it's a lot to take in," she said gently, "but I hope it helps you find some closure." Michael wasn't sure what kind of closure he could find in this new revelation, but he knew that he couldn't ignore it. He had to confront David again. He needed to know if his old friend had been lying to him all along, if there was even more to the story that he had yet to uncover. Later that evening, back at home, Michael sat in his study, staring at the envelope Laura had given him. He hadn't opened it yet, hadn't been ready to face whatever was inside. Instead, he had spent the afternoon trying to make sense of everything, to understand what this new information meant for his life, for his relationship with Sarah, and for his future with Ella and Liam. He knew he needed to tell Ella the truth, but the thought of burdening her with this weighed heavily on him. She had already been through so much, and the idea of dragging her into even more uncertainty felt cruel. But at the same time, he couldn't keep this from her. Not after everything they had shared. As he sat there, lost in thought, Ella appeared in the doorway, her expression filled with concern. "You've been quiet all day," she said softly. "Did something happen?" Michael hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah," he admitted, his voice heavy. "Something happened." Ella walked into the room, sitting down across from him. "What is it?" she asked, her voice gentle but firm. Michael took a deep breath, then handed her the envelope. "I met with someone today, a woman named Laura. She knew Sarah, and she had some things to tell me. About Sarah's past." Ella frowned, glancing down at the envelope in her hands. "What kind of things?" Michael sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It turns out there was more to Sarah's relationship with David than I knew. She was involved in something illegal, something dangerous. That's part of the reason she left him. She was trying to escape." Ella's eyes widened, her expression shifting from concern to shock. "Illegal," she echoed. "What do you mean?" Michael explained everything Laura had told him, the money laundering, the decision to leave, and the fear that had driven Sarah's choices. As he spoke, Ella's face remained stoic, but he could see the emotions swirling behind her eyes. When he finished, Ella sat in silence for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the envelope. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "I thought we had finally uncovered everything." Michael nodded, his heart heavy. "So did I," he admitted, "but it seems like there's always more." They sat together in the quiet of the study, both of them grappling with the weight of the new revelation. It felt like they had been walking through a labyrinth for months, always uncovering more twists and turns, never quite finding their way out. Finally, Ella spoke, her voice quiet but resolute. "We'll figure it out," she said. "And whatever this means, whatever comes next, we'll face it together." Michael looked at her, his heart swelling with gratitude. "I don't know what I'd do without you," he whispered. Ella smiled, though her eyes were still filled with uncertainty. "You'll never have to find out," she said softly. As they sat together, the weight of the past still pressing down on them, Michael knew that the journey wasn't over yet. There were still more questions to be answered, more shadows to confront, but whatever lay ahead, he knew they would face it together. The air in the study was heavy, thick with the tension of what Michael and Ella had just discussed. For a moment, it felt like they were back at square one, unraveling yet another part of Sarah's life they hadn't known. Michael's heart raced as he tried to process the weight of Laura's revelation. He had thought he had come to terms with Sarah's secrets, thought he had finally found peace with the woman he had loved for so long. But this new layer, the criminal element to her past, changed everything. Michael had always seen Sarah as someone who had made difficult but ultimately human choices. She had hidden things from him, but her motivations had seemed grounded in fear and love for her family. Now, with the knowledge that she had been involved in money laundering, the picture became more complex. She had made darker choices than he had ever imagined. And it wasn't just about protecting herself from David. She had been running from a far more dangerous reality. But as Michael looked at Ella, the woman who had come into his life like a force of nature, and at Liam, who was quietly sleeping down the hall, he knew that none of this changed the love they had built. The truth, no matter how painful, had brought them closer together, and that was something Sarah could never have taken from them. "We have to move forward," Michael said quietly, breaking the silence between them. "We've spent so much time trying to figure out the past, to understand Sarah's choices, but I think we have to let it go now." Ella looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of emotions, sadness, relief, and something like determination. "You're right," she said softly. "We've been searching for answers for so long. Maybe it's time to stop searching and start living." Michael nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "I don't want to let her choices define us anymore," he continued. "Sarah made her decisions, and she had her reasons, But that's not who we are. We've built something different, something better." Ella smiled, her eyes softening as she reached out and took Michael's hand. "We're a family," she whispered, "and we have to protect that." The next morning, the air was crisp and clear, the early autumn sun casting a golden glow over the city as Michael and Ella sat on the back porch, sipping coffee in the quiet morning light. Liam was playing in the yard, his laughter echoing through the air as he chased a ball around the grass. It was a simple moment, but for Michael, it was profound. This was what he had always wanted, a life filled with love, with family, with moments that felt real and grounded. He had spent so many years chasing the ghosts of the past, trying to make sense of the things he had lost. But now, sitting here with Ella and Liam, he realized that the future was what mattered most. "What's going on in that head of yours?" Ella asked, breaking the comfortable silence. Michael smiled, his heart swelling with affection. "Just thinking about how lucky I am," he said quietly. Ella laughed softly. "You're always saying that." "Because it's true," Michael replied, his voice filled with sincerity. "I spent so long feeling like I'd never have this, never have a family again. But you and Liam, you've changed everything for me." Ella's smile widened, but there was a flicker of something more in her eyes, something thoughtful. "You've changed everything for us too, Michael," she said, her voice soft. "I never thought I'd find someone who cared about me and Liam the way you do. You've given us a home, a real home." Michael's chest tightened with emotion. "It's all I've ever wanted," he said, "to be part of a family again." Ella nodded, her expression growing more serious. "So, what do we do now?" she asked, the question hanging in the air between them. Michael took a deep breath, thinking carefully before he answered. "We move forward," he said finally. "We've spent so much time looking back, trying to understand the past, but I think it's time to focus on the future, on what we're building together." Ella nodded, her eyes filled with a quiet resolve. "I agree," she said. "No more secrets, no more looking back, just us." Michael smiled, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. For the first time in years, the weight of the past felt like it was finally lifting. He wasn't running from the truth anymore, wasn't trying to untangle the threads of Sarah's life. He had faced it all, her secrets, David's betrayal, and the pain that had come with it, and now he was ready to leave it behind. As the morning wore on, Michael and Ella spent the day together with Liam, laughing and playing in the yard, making plans for the future. They talked about taking another trip, this time to the coast, where they could spend a week by the ocean, away from the city and the memories that lingered there. But more than that, they talked about their future, about what it would look like now that the shadows of the past had finally been laid to rest. Ella was thinking about going back to school, pursuing a career in social work, something she had always wanted to do but had put off after Liam was born. Michael encouraged her, offering his full support. He wanted her to follow her dreams, to create the life she had always wanted, and for Michael, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had stepped back from his business after Sarah's death, but now, with a clearer mind and heart, he was ready to dive back in. Not for the money or the success, but because he wanted to build something that would last, something he could be proud of. As the sun began to set, casting a warm, golden light over the yard, Michael watched as Ella scooped Liam up into her arms, his giggles filling the air. The sight made his heart swell with a love that felt almost overwhelming. This was his family. This was his future. For so long, he had been afraid that the secrets of the past would destroy everything. But now, he knew that they had made it through the worst. They had faced the truth, confronted the pain, and come out stronger on the other side. A few weeks later, Michael decided to meet with David one last time. After everything that had come to light, Sarah's involvement in the money laundering, the secrets she had kept, Michael needed to know where David stood. He didn't expect their friendship to fully recover, but he wanted to understand how much David had known and what role he had played in Sarah's choices. They met at the same cafe where they had confronted each other months earlier, but this time, the tension between them had eased. David looked weary, but relieved, as though he had been waiting for this moment as much as Michael had. "I want to be honest with you," David said quietly after they sat down. "I didn't know how deep Sarah was involved in what I was doing. I swear, Michael, she left before things got bad. And after that, I didn't want to drag her back into it." Michael studied David's face, searching for any signs of deception. But there was nothing there, just a man who had made mistakes and was trying to atone for them. "I believe you," Michael said finally, his voice steady. "But we're never going to be the same, David. Too much has happened." David nodded, his eyes filled with regret. "I know," he said. "I just want you to know that I never wanted to hurt you. Or Sarah." Michael nodded, feeling a sense of closure settle over him. "I know, but this is the end of the road for us." With that, they parted ways. Michael walked away from the cafe feeling lighter than he had in years. He had made peace with David, with Sarah, and most importantly, with himself. The months that followed were filled with new beginnings. Ella started her classes, diving into her studies with a passion that Michael admired. Liam continued to grow, his laughter filling their home with joy, and Michael, for the first time in a long time, felt truly at peace. The past was behind them, and the future, bright, hopeful, and full of love, was theirs to build together. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.